Hey guys, tonight we're venturing somewhere few dare to tread, into the shadows of medieval privies, outhouses, and chamber pots. You're not strolling through a perfumed palace or gliding over marble floors. Nope, you're ducking beneath beams, sidestepping something suspicious on the floor, and holding your breath. You'll want to. Welcome to the surprisingly complex, often hilarious, sometimes horrifying world of medieval bathroom life. Right now, imagine you're wrapped in scratchy wool, clutching a flickering lantern, and searching for a place to go. Not figuratively, literally. It's late. You're full of turnip stew, and the nearest loo, it's either down a narrow spiral staircase with no handrail across a muddy field, or simply a pot under your bed. Whichever you choose, one thing's certain: you probably won't survive this cleanly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your city and local time. Let's see how many of you are listening from candlelit corners of the world right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin with a simple need, the same need you feel today, but in a world without plumbing, porcelain, or privacy relieving yourself was anything but simple. The phrase going to the bathroom didn't even exist. No one went to the bathroom because there wasn't one, at least not the way we think of it. The medieval world offered a few choices, and none of them were great. The rich had the garderobe, a fancy French-sounding word that basically meant hole in the wall. Quite literally a hole that dropped waste straight down, sometimes into the moat, sometimes onto unsuspecting alley-goers below. But you, dear traveler, are not royalty tonight. You're a mid-level peasant with 3 chickens, no running water, and a healthy fear of stepping barefoot on anything squishy. During the day, you might wander into the woods and crouch behind a bush, whispering apologies to passing deer. But at night, you shuffle to the edge of your one-room hut, lift the wooden lid of a slop bucket, and try not to wake the baby sleeping inches away. In winter, the icy sting is as shocking as the smell. In summer, flies patrol the airspace with military precision. To relieve yourself indoors, you use what's called a chamber pot. Sounds fancy, doesn't it? It's not. It's a ceramic or metal bowl you crouch over or hover above. By morning, it's full. So full. And then what? You either empty it into a backyard cesspit, which is just a polite word for a hole of horrors, or you shout something like "Gardy-loo" and hurl it out the window. That's not slang. That's an actual warning call derived from the French gardes l'eau, watch out for the water. Except it wasn't water. Historians still argue whether most households truly flung their waste into the streets daily or used designated dumping areas. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. What's certain is that medieval towns reeked. Chroniclers of the time didn't shy away from describing the stench in vivid detail. One even wrote that in summer the roads fumed like a dragon's breath. As for privacy, forget it. Entire families shared space. If you were lucky, a linen curtain might separate your night soil moment from grandma's snoring. But more often you just squatted and hoped for a little mercy from the shadows. Despite the filth, most medieval folks accepted this as normal. There were no scented candles, no air fresheners, no flush and forget. What went in must come out and then stay somewhere nearby, usually attracting rats. And yet people survived, Mostly. One quirky tidbit. Some nobles believed that holding it in strengthened your moral character. There are letters and records praising kings who delayed their bowel movements for days, as if willpower alone proved divine right. Spoiler, it did not. Still, the truth is, your body didn't care if you were king or cook. When it was time, it was time. And what happened next often depended on where you were, what you wore, and whether you could afford someone else to deal with the aftermath. So as you settle deeper into your pillow and let your thoughts wander through time, know this: before indoor plumbing came along, everyone had to improvise. Whether you were sneaking into the woods, climbing a freezing tower, or whispering sorry to the bucket going to the bathroom in the Middle Ages was anything but forgettable. You're climbing a narrow spiral staircase in the dark. No handrails, no torch. The stone is slick beneath your bare feet, and you're clutching your cloak around your knees because the wind is howling through the cracks in the wall. You've got to go. And in a medieval castle, that means one thing: the garderobe. It sounds elegant, doesn't it, garderobe? Like something you'd hang velvet gowns in. But no, this is your toilet. Or more accurately, a stone seat perched high above the earth with a drop so long you'd rather not think about it. The opening is just wide enough for your business to fall through, not you, hopefully. Castle designers were clever in their own way. They often placed garderobes at the outer edges of the walls, allowing waste to fall into moats or pits. Some were built as vertical shafts, running the height of a tower, so every level could enjoy the amenities. You might be using the same shaft as the lord 2 floors above. Let's hope he went first. The stone seat was cold, year-round, unforgiving in winter, and home to all sorts of creatures. There are records of rats scurrying up garderobe chutes and surprising their victims mid-squat. And don't even think about spiders. You're not alone in there. Garderobes had doors sometimes, but more often they were tucked away in niches or behind thick curtains. A bit of privacy, sure, but they were still very much part of the castle's architecture. You could be mid-relief when a knight strolled past in full armor, offering a polite nod before continuing to the training yard. Here's the kicker. Many garderobes weren't cleaned at all, ever. Some had chutes that dropped directly into the moat, which became more of a soup over time. Don't drink from the moat wasn't just good advice, it was survival. Historians still argue whether these waste-filled moats were intentional sanitation systems or simply an unfortunate side effect of poor engineering. And yes, it stank, but oddly, some people believed the stench kept away illness. The theory of miasma, bad air spreading disease, led some to burn herbs nearby or hang sweet-smelling flowers near the garderobe. Others leaned into the stink, believing it balanced the humors. Medicine and plumbing. Not exactly best friends in this era. Still, there's a strange logic to the garderobe. If you're going to go, why not let gravity do the work? It required no bucket, no shoveling, and if you aimed well, no mess, in theory. The reality. Let's just say castle servants were not paid nearly enough. A quirky twist. Some garderobes doubled as storage. Believe it or not, people would hang their robes and linens near the privy hole. Why? Because they believed the ammonia from the waste kept moths away. That's right. You're taking your noble cloak into the one room guaranteed to smell like doom because it might kill bugs. Fashion meets function, meets filth. And what about emergencies? Say it's midnight. You're halfway through a feast, and the wine hits you like a battering ram. Climbing stairs in the dark isn't exactly appealing. That's where the trusty chamber pot came in again. Even in castles, nobles kept them under their beds or chairs. If you were lucky, a servant carried it off in the morning. If not, well, let's just say the lower levels of the castle were in for a surprise. There were no designated toilet breaks during banquets. You just excused yourself, shuffled away, and hoped to return before they brought out the candied almonds. For kings and queens, there was often a small side room built just for this purpose known as a closet. And yes, that's where our modern term for a tiny private space comes from, because medieval royalty sometimes pooped in the closet. Let's not forget the design challenges. Wind could whip up through the garderobe shaft, delivering a chilly and unwelcome breeze to the nether regions. Rain, same problem, but wetter. Some castles added a little wooden flap to help shield delicate areas. Think of it as the medieval version of a toilet lid, except not one you'd want to touch. Now the question you're probably not asking, but absolutely should, what about toilet paper spoiler? They didn't have it. Castle dwellers might use straw moss or even a scrap of fabric if they were feeling regal. Occasionally, a smooth stick or a bit of hay was used. And no, there was no bidet, no gentle spray, just you, your chosen wiping tool, and a strong hope that no one would notice later at court. Despite the cold, the drafts, the odors, and the very real chance of falling through the castle garderobe was considered the best bathroom option of the time. It beat digging a hole in the ground. It beat wandering into the woods. It definitely beat trying to hold it in until morning. So tonight, as you tuck yourself beneath soft sheets and listen to the low hum of modern plumbing, spare a sleepy thought for the medieval soul dangling their rear over a 30-foot drop, hoping the wind was blowing in the right direction and the rats weren't feeling adventurous. Because in a world without toilet paper plumbing or seat warmers, the only thing separating you from disaster was a little stone ledge and a whole lot of faith. You wake up in the dead of night. The air is still. The only sound is the soft crackle of the dying hearth. But something else is stirring the fullness in your belly from last night's barley stew and a handful too many of dried prunes. Nature is calling, not softly, not politely, just urgently. But you're no noble with a garderobe built into your stone tower. You're a city dweller, maybe a baker's apprentice or a tanner's wife. And in your world, someone has to deal with all of it when morning comes. Enter the gong farmer. Now before you laugh, and it's okay, the name is ridiculous, this was a real job. Gong meant dung. And a gong farmer was exactly what it sounds like, a person hired to dig us and haul away the filth from cesspits, privies, and latrines across town. If you thought your job was rough, imagine climbing into a pit of week-old waste with nothing but a shovel and the hope that nothing splashed. They worked at night, always. Not because they were mysterious creatures of the shadows, but because the smell was too much during the day. Even medieval folk, who weren't known for their fragrance standards, couldn't stomach it. So when the town slept, the gong farmer went to work. You step outside with your lantern tiptoeing around puddles that you hope are water, and you pass by a public latrine. You don't see him, but he's there down below, knee-deep in the past week's worst decisions. A few layers of rag cover his face, not for modesty but for protection. Not that cloth can do much against methane and rot. And yes, methane was a real hazard. Some cesspits could build up enough gas to explode. Imagine that. You're walking past a latrine when the earth beneath you rumbles, and a geyser of medieval memory bursts skyward. Historians still argue whether any deaths were caused by cesspit explosions, but it's a grim enough possibility that it was noted in legal documents. Now here's where it gets weird. Gong farmers were both essential and shunned. Town councils paid them well, sometimes even very well, for their work, because without them, the streets and pits would overflow. But socially, these poor souls were untouchables. You wouldn't break bread with a gong farmer. You wouldn't marry one. In some towns, they had to live in separate quarters, literally downwind. A quirky fact. Some gong farmers were known to collect more than just waste. Lost rings, coins, and jewelry often found their way into the muck, and with gloves, or more likely bare hands, they'd fish them out. There are actual court records of peasants accusing gong farmers of stealing from the muck as if they didn't earn every cursed shilling. You might wonder, why didn't anyone just dump their waste in the river? Oh, they did, constantly. But cesspits were necessary because not everyone lived near a convenient stream, and over time they became deep, layered nightmares that needed regular emptying. That's where the gong farmer came in. They'd hoist the waste out bucket by bucket, load it into carts, and haul it outside city walls to be dumped. Sometimes it was buried. Sometimes it was sold to farmers as fertilizer. Yes, sold. Because in a strange twist of medieval logic, poop had value. Still, you wouldn't want to be behind that cart. The smell would cling to your clothes like gossip in a small village. It was said you could smell a gong farmer before you saw him, and once you saw him, you wished you hadn't. Now, not every cesspit was the same. Wealthier homes had private latrines that fed into small brick chambers, while poor neighborhoods shared larger communal pits that were only emptied once they absolutely had to be. Some towns had laws about how often they had to be cleaned, but enforcement, let's just say if you had political friends, your waste could linger a little longer. Despite the filth, the gong farmer was vital to city life. Without them, disease would spread even faster. And spread it did. Typhoid, cholera, dysentery. They were all frequent guests in medieval cities. Though people didn't fully understand germ theory, they had a gut sense that waste and illness were linked. One London record from the 14th century shows city officials trying to force landlords to maintain clean pits, an effort doomed to fail spectacularly, but at least they tried. Now picture the farmer himself, sunken eyes, weathered face, hands calloused from wood and stone, and a quiet resolve that only comes from nightly confrontation with humanity's worst. He doesn't get thanks. He doesn't get glory. But he keeps the city functioning barely. So the next time you flush your toilet and watch your waste vanish like magic, whisper a sleepy thanks to the midnight men who climbed into pits with shovels, rags, and a grim sense of purpose. Because without them, medieval towns would have drowned in their own history, literally. You're walking through the town square on a crisp spring morning. The sun is peeking through wooden beams and crooked rooftops. Merchants are shouting about their onions and salted herring, and you've got a little extra spring in your step because today you're heading to the public latrine. Yes, a shared toilet, but don't wince just yet. Public latrines in the medieval world weren't always the cesspools you might imagine. In fact, some were downright impressive, carved stone benches, flowing water beneath, and privacy dividers if you were lucky. It was a place to go sure, but it was also a place to talk to, catch up to gossip about the neighbor's new chicken. Going to the bathroom could be social. In larger towns, latrines were sometimes sponsored by guilds or wealthy benefactors who wanted to earn a little heavenly credit. Build a toilet, save your soul was not an official doctrine, but it was close enough. Some monasteries even built public latrines for townsfolk as part of their service to the poor, and when done right, they were marvels of early sanitation. Running water from diverted streams would whisk waste away into rivers or distant fields. Gravity was the real hero here. Imagine a long stone or wooden bench with multiple holes, side by side, no partitions. You sit trousers modestly bunched around your ankles while a stranger a few inches away clears his throat and comments on the price of grain. It's a weirdly intimate, awkwardly normal moment, and totally expected. There were no gendered signs, no little silhouettes of a man in tights or a woman in a wimple. People went where they went. Historians still debate whether men and women used these spaces together or at separate times. Some suggest morning hours were for women and afternoons for men. Others think they were segregated entirely. But one thing's clear, privacy wasn't a huge priority. Here's a fun tidbit. Medieval latrines often had little scrub brushes or piles of hay for wiping. But in some fancier places, especially in southern Europe, there's evidence that bits of cloth were soaked in vinegar and reused. Yes, reused. In a communal bathroom, shared wiping cloths, you might want to breathe through your sleeve now. Still, for all their flaws, public latrines were a step toward organized hygiene. They helped reduce the amount of waste dumped directly onto the streets, though that still happened plenty. Some towns had laws requiring businesses to provide latrine access for workers, especially those in messy trades, like tanning or brewing. Whether anyone enforced those rules, that's another debate. Now, not all public latrines were glorious. In some villages, they were little more than wooden sheds built over a pit. In wetter areas, they were perched over streams, allowing nature to do the flushing. But in cities like London or Paris, you could find well-built structures, often with multiple stalls, ventilation slats, and brace yourself communal sponges. Yes, the famous Roman sponge on a stick tradition didn't vanish entirely. In some places, it lingered, dipped in vinegar between uses. It sounds horrifying now, but at the time, it was simply practical. And here's the thing people talked. Public latrines were part bathroom, part newsstand. Gossip flowed as freely as everything else. Who was getting married? Who was getting arrested? Who was caught trying to fake a miracle at the cathedral? Latrines were where news spread fast, because nothing makes conversation move quicker than a shared urgency. Of course, not everyone approved. Some moralists and priests warned that latrines could lead to immoral chatter or worse, inappropriate touching. There are written complaints from church leaders who feared that too much mixing in public bathrooms would lead to sin, because obviously nothing is more seductive than the smell of 30 people's decisions wafting through a stone hallway. There were also practical dangers. Pickpockets loved crowded public latrines. While your hands and attention were occupied, someone could lift your purse. It happened enough that some towns posted guards outside the busiest facilities. Imagine applying for that job. Hello, yes, I'd like to watch the bathroom door all day. And in winter, these places became icy death traps. Moisture-poor construction and freezing temperatures made latrine floors treacherous. Falling into a medieval toilet was more than embarrassing, it could be fatal. There are chilling accounts of people slipping, hitting their heads, and being found hours later frozen and alone. One poor soul even fell into a latrine shaft and drowned. That's not a myth, that's just medieval. Still, for many, public latrines were a better option than chamber pots or alleyways. They gave people a designated place to go, reducing the stench in city centers, at least slightly. And while the experience was far from luxurious, it was part of daily life. Normal, accepted, even kind of communal. So tonight, as you drift further into that hazy space between thought and dream picture, in a row of humble townsfolk cloaks pulled around their knees, chatting softly as the stream gurgles beneath them. It's not glamorous, but it's human, honest, and somehow still easier than finding parking in a modern city. You're standing atop the drawbridge of a formidable stone castle, gazing down at the murky moat below. At first glance, it's just a wide ring of water, a defense against invading armies, a barrier to battering rams, maybe even a place to dump rotten food. But if you're paying attention, if you breathe in just a little too deeply, you'll notice something else lingering on the breeze. Something foul, something human. That's right, this moat is full of more than just water. Welcome to the medieval sanitation system, where castles didn't just defend from the outside, they disposed from the inside. And the moat? It was often the final resting place for everything flushed down the garderobes, tossed from chamber pots, or scraped from banquet floors. Waste had to go somewhere, and if there was already a big wet ditch around your home, why not use it? At the time, it seemed practical. You build your castle with gravity in mind, placing toilet shafts along the outer walls. Waste travels down, out of sight, out of mind. But unfortunately, it didn't travel far. It dropped directly into the moat or onto nearby ground. Over time, that moat, especially if stagnant, became a foul stew of human waste, animal entrails, and whatever else the kitchen scullions didn't want to deal with. Still, the belief was that the moat would wash it all away. That's assuming it connected to a river or had some kind of natural current. But many moats didn't. They were closed loops. The water just sat there. And as the waste built up, so did the smell and the flies. Clouds of them, buzzing around castle walls, landing on bread, occasionally flying into open mouths during poorly timed yawns. One quirky legend from France tells of a siege where attackers tried to tunnel under a castle wall and accidentally broke into the cesspit drain leading into the moat. They fled, gagging, and the siege ended not in battle, but in bowel-borne terror. Whether true or not, it illustrates just how disgusting these moats could be. Historians still argue whether this use of moats was widespread or more of an unfortunate accident of convenience. Some castles, particularly later in the medieval period, began diverting waste into separate channels to avoid contamination. Others, especially early constructions, simply let it all flow into the water. Of course, that posed problems. Soldiers defending the castle had to stand guard beside a literal latrine river. Servants fetching water might find themselves dipping buckets into something more soup than spring. And in summer, oh summer was especially fragrant. Some castle dwellers burned herbs or hung scented flowers along the battlements in a futile effort to mask the odor. You might think, why not just clean the moat? Excellent question. The answer: because it was enormous muddy and filled with sludge that no one wanted to touch. Cleaning a moat was a rare Herculean task, often only done when the smell became unbearable or disease broke out. Even then, it was more common to add fresh water than to remove the filth, like putting perfume on a corpse. Still, the moat remained a multi-purpose marvel in the medieval mind. Defense disposal deterrent. It kept enemies out and kept waste somewhere else. Just don't go swimming in it. But moats weren't the only bodies of water that suffered this fate. In towns, rivers often became catch-alls for waste. Bakers tossed ash tanners, dumped chemicals, and butchers flung entrails. And when chamber pots were emptied into gutters, the runoff flowed into nearby streams. The result: rivers that once provided drinking water turned into slow-moving broths of disease. And yet somehow people kept drinking from them, because they didn't know better. Germ theory didn't exist. People thought illness came from bad air, not dirty water. They would boil it sometimes, yes, but mostly they just held their noses and hoped for the best. There's one particularly grim record from medieval London that describes dead dogs, offal, and night soil all collecting in the river Fleet. The stench was so bad that officials tried to cover parts of the river with wooden planks just so people could walk past without vomiting. Imagine being a boatman asked to ferry goods down that channel. Hazard pay should have been invented just for that job. And let's not forget what all this meant for the poor. The rich could afford clean-ish wells or private latrines. But peasants? They often had no choice but to collect water from whatever stream ran past their hovel. And when that stream was also your neighbor's bathroom, well, let's just say intestinal fortitude was very literal. A particularly bleak quote from a 14th century friar describes a town whose children drank from the same stream in which pigs bathed women, rinsed laundry, and the dead were floated downstream. It wasn't poetry, it was survival. So tonight, as you lie warm and safe with your nearest plumbing system humming quietly behind the wall, think about the castle dweller peering down at the moat, wondering whether that splash was a fish or something far less pleasant. And if you ever time travel to the Middle Ages, bring bottled water. Lots of it. You're out in the countryside now, far from castle walls and crowded city squares. The air is fresh. The grass is damp with morning dew. Birds are chirping, and your boots squish softly in the mud as you walk past hedgerows and low stone walls. But hold on, where's the toilet if you're a peasant living in a timber-framed cottage with a straw roof and a floor made of packed earth? Chances are there is no toilet, not in the way you know it, not even close. When nature calls you, head outside, just anywhere. The simplest and most common solution: a hole in the ground, dug with a spade, covered in branches. Sometimes you squat behind a haystack, other times behind the barn, and when it rains, which it often does, you aim quickly and pray your feet don't slide out from under you. This is the art of aiming medieval edition. For most rural folk, the toilet was wherever it was convenient, private-ish and downwind. Families sometimes dug small pits behind their cottages, unlined, uncovered, and decidedly temporary. You used it until it filled. Then you filled it in and dug another one a few feet away. And if that seems like a lot of effort for something that happens every day, well, welcome to the reality of medieval sanitation. Now, if you were feeling a bit fancy or had livestock to protect, you might build a privy. Think of it as a wooden outhouse 4 planks a door that didn't quite shut, and a wooden bench with a round hole cut out of it. Ventilation was built in because the cracks between the boards let in the breeze, sometimes too much. There were no vents, no fans, just air hope, and maybe a dried bundle of herbs hanging from the ceiling to chase away the worst smells. And you'd better aim well, because that hole in the bench didn't lead to an endless void. It led to a pit, a very visible pit. Miss the mark, and someone, probably you, was cleaning it up. Kids, of course, were terrible at this. So were drunk uncles. And when it overflowed, you either scooped it out with a bucket or you dug a new pit and moved the entire outhouse. And yes, that's where the term moving house got its less glamorous cousin, moving the privy. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Some communities had shared holes, not latrines exactly, but designated bushes, ditches, or copse clearings where people went because everyone just knew. A sort of informal toilet zone. You might be doing your business, only to hear someone say hello a few bushes over. And yes, it was awkward, but it was also normal. Historians still argue whether rural privies were common or a luxury. In wetter regions, they likely weren't needed as much rains washed things away. In drier places, pits may have lasted longer. But what's clear is this: the further you lived from town, the more your bathroom needs were dictated by weather terrain and how close the goats were sleeping. Then there's the matter of wiping. This was not an age of Charmin. Out here, peasants used what they had. Moss was a favorite soft absorbent and usually nearby. Leaves worked too, though you had to be careful. Some were less forgiving. Straw was common, especially near barns. But straw cuts both ways literally. Use with caution. A fringe belief among some folk healers held that wiping with certain herbs could prevent disease or even unwanted pregnancy. Rue sage and yarrow were popular choices, not that science backs that up. But when your bathroom routine is already half ritual and half survival, you take what comfort you can. Disposal was another problem. Sometimes the waste stayed put, soaking into the soil. Other times it was scooped and used as fertilizer. Night soil, they called it. Rich in nutrients, poor in every other category. This practice led to some spectacularly unfortunate events. One old tale tells of a farmer who misjudged the compost pile and planted his cabbages too close to a leaking latrine. The result? Enormous cabbages. In a village that couldn't quite decide whether to be impressed or disgusted, probably both. And let's not forget winter. Imagine kneeling over a snow-covered pit in freezing wind, the wood seat rhymed with frost. Or worse, trying to dig a new hole in frozen earth. Some households solved this with chamber pots indoors, emptying them at dawn. Others just held it. For hours, days. It was a test of willpower and bladders. But even in this rustic reality, there was community. If your neighbor's privy collapsed, you lent your shovel. If your pit overflowed, someone might offer straw. And yes, you did sometimes gossip about who had the worst smelling outhouse, because in a world with no plumbing judgment came in many forms. So tonight, as your pillow softens and your breathing slows, think about that quiet field behind the cottage. The steam rising gently from a newly dug hole, the distant sound of a rooster, the peace of knowing that despite everything, medieval folks found a way to answer the call, rain, shine, or frostbite, and hopefully didn't slip in the process. You wake up to the sound of livestock grumbling and morning bells clanging faintly in the distance. Sunlight peeks through wooden shutters, catching flecks of dust in the air. The straw-stuffed mattress beneath you has left crisscross marks on your arm. You stretch yawn and realize you've got to go. But before you even consider walking out into the cold morning mist, your eyes drift toward the humble ceramic pot tucked beneath your bed. Ah, yes, the chamber pot, the unsung hero of medieval mornings. Used by nearly everyone, from the noblest noble to the sleepiest serf, chamber pots were the default nighttime solution. No stumbling through pitch-black hallways, no braving wind or wolves. Just roll over, do your business in a bowl, and hope no one kicks it over in the dark. They came in all shapes and materials, basic clay, pewter, even brass for those who wanted their bathroom break to glint in candlelight. Some had lids, most didn't. Some had decorations, floral patterns, carved rims, even cheeky Latin inscriptions that basically said, "Here it comes," because even then people had a sense of humor about bodily functions. Once full, and that happened fast in houses with multiple people, they had to be emptied. That task usually fell to the least fortunate member of the household, a servant, a younger sibling, or you if you drew the short straw. So where did it all go? In theory, you'd carry it outside and dump it into a cesspit latrine or designated waste trench. In theory. In practice, most chamber pots were emptied out windows, and that brings us to one of the most infamous phrases of the medieval world, gardilou. This wasn't a quirky nickname, it was a literal warning derived from the French gardes l'eau, watch out for the water. Except it wasn't water. It was a tidal wave of last night's digestive consequences hurtling toward the cobbled street below. You'd shout it out as loudly as possible, usually in the early morning hours. Gardilou pause, splash. If you were lucky, pedestrians scattered in time. If not, well, they learned a hard lesson in medieval physics. Historians still debate whether chamber pot dumping was legally allowed. In many cities, laws were passed banning it outright, with fines for those caught. But enforcement was lax, and people had a habit of quite literally getting away with it. Some towns eventually created dumping hours, allowing people to empty their pots only during certain windows of time, a strange sort of flush rush, if you will. Of course, this practice made walking the streets a hazardous affair, especially narrow alleys where houses leaned in toward one another. Rain was one thing, but you learned quickly not to walk too close to the walls. You also learned to never look up with your mouth open. In some cases, people added little splash deflectors to their windowsills' curved ledges that redirected flying waste outward, away from the foundation. Think of them as the medieval cousin to a rain gutter, except profoundly more disgusting. Now, nobles didn't necessarily toss their waste into the streets. They had staff for that. The groom of the stool, which we'll explore in a later section, often handled royal relief with white gloves and solemn dignity. But even in stately homes, chamber pots reigned supreme. The difference was who carried them, not who filled them. And yes, they were sometimes used in public. Traveling, you'd bring a portable pot, staying at an inn. Hope there's one in your room. There's even evidence of people using them on carriages, discreetly tucked under benches, with an unfortunate hole drilled through the bottom for ventilation. Imagine that as your rideshare option. And what about odor? Good question. Some pots were rinsed with vinegar or ash to neutralize the smell. Others were simply kept near the window, open windows being the medieval equivalent of air freshener. It didn't really work, but it gave people the illusion of hygiene, which in those days was about as good as it got. A quirky tidbit. Some chamber pots were passed down through families. Heirloom bathroom bowls. They'd be inscribed, decorated, even blessed by priests. Because if you're going to relieve yourself, why not do it in something with a family crest? Of course, accidents happened. People tripped, pots cracked, and every so often someone forgot to shout Gardyloo before dumping. There are actual city records of injuries caused by falling waste. A woman in Edinburgh once sued her neighbor after being struck in the shoulder by an airborne pot and smote with the substance therein. She won. So tonight, as you reach for your blanket and nestle deeper into sleep, remember this. For most of history, the last thing people saw before breakfast wasn't sunrise, it was the underside of a chamber pot. And tomorrow morning, when you shuffle to your clean porcelain toilet and flush with the lightest touch, whisper a quiet thanks to those who came before. They walked the cobbled gauntlet so you wouldn't have to. You're wandering a cramped medieval alleyway, the kind barely wide enough to stretch both arms. The cobblestones are uneven beneath your shoes, and something sticky clings to the edge of your soul. You don't want to know what it is. And above you, wooden shutters swing open with a creak. There's a shout, Gardyloo, and you run. Too late. You've just been baptized by the Middle Ages. Yes, we're talking about one of the most dangerous jobs in medieval cities, walking outside. See, when you live in a town where every house has a chamber pot, and most folks lack the time or courtesy to carry it all the way to the local cesspit, the solution is simple. You toss it out the window. Ideally, you warn the public first, but let's be honest, not everyone did. Cities like London, Paris, and Edinburgh all had narrow streets, overhanging buildings, and little in the way of sewers. What this meant was that gravity did most of the waste management. Upper floors leaned out and dumped their daily offerings into the gutter, a literal trench carved down the center of the street. And by gutter, we don't mean a tidy hidden pipe. We mean a shallow open channel filled with gray water refuse mud, and yes, other things. To walk down a medieval street was to dance with danger. You kept your cloak and pulled tight, your hood up, and your eyes on the windows. You listened for movement, a clatter, a shout, any sign that a bucket's worth of last night's stew and what came after it might come flying down. Historians still argue whether people truly did this daily or whether it was exaggerated in satire and complaints. But the evidence stacks up street ordinances banning the practice city records of waste fines and enough written accounts to gag a goat. You might think, well, surely they cleaned the streets, and sometimes, yes, they tried. Many cities hired rakers workers who shoveled refuse out of the gutters and carted it away, but they were few, underpaid, and usually overwhelmed. After festivals or markets, the streets became carnivals of sludge. In London, rakers were often hired only once a week. The rest of the time, the waste just lingered. Let's not forget the smell. Descriptions from travelers are vivid. One German merchant wrote that the streets of Paris in summer reeked like a charnel house after a storm. Some towns sprinkled herbs or burned incense along main roads to mask the odor. It worked about as well as you'd expect. And here's a quirky twist. Some people believed stepping in waste was good luck. Not because it was sanitary, but because it was common. Everyone did it. Nobles, bakers, monks. So if your boot was soaked in gutter juice, it meant you were walking where the people walked. You were part of the crowd. It was also, let's be honest, a coping mechanism. There were other hazards too. Waste attracted animals, rats, dogs, pigs. In many cities, pigs roamed freely snuffling through muck for food. They became walking compost bins and sometimes trampling hazards. More than one child was crushed by a wandering hog while trying to leap over a gutter stream. In some towns, street levels rose over the centuries from the sheer buildup of refuse excrement and mud. Archaeologists have found old doors buried under layers of compacted filth, entire first floors lost to the history of poor sanitation. And yet people adapted. They wore high boots. They built raised walkways in wealthy districts, wooden planks or stone curbs that let you walk slightly above the mess. In a strange way, this became a status symbol. Those who could afford clean shoes weren't just rich, they were elevated. One memorable law in medieval York required tenants to sweep the street in front of their homes weekly. If they didn't, they were fined, and the fine was paid in dung. That's right. You cleaned up poop, or you paid with more poop. Bureaucracy medieval style. Of course, there were always those who refused to deal with it. Some people simply dumped their waste directly on their neighbor's doorstep during the night. Feuds were started. Fights broke out. There are records of night soil wars between households, each blaming the other for the morning's stink. In one town, a baker was taken to court for hurling slop into his rival's chimney, and still the system limped along. The streets remained perilous, the gutters a gauntlet, but life continued. Markets thrived, children played, lovers strolled carefully. Humanity's ability to adapt even to the worst conditions is honestly impressive. So tonight, as you drift deeper into sleep, imagine that narrow street, the moon overhead, the faint squish of leather boots on cobbles. You glance up, hear a creak, and dash to safety just in time. You smile. You made it. Another day, another dry cloak. But just in case, maybe sleep on the inside of the bed tonight. You never know what might trickle under the door. You've escaped the city. The air is clearer. The streets are no longer liquid obstacle courses. But before you get too comfortable, you realize you still have that very human, very inevitable urge. So you glance around, searching for something vaguely private, vaguely hidden. You find a narrow side path, follow it behind a crumbling stone wall, and there it is, a wooden bench with a hole nestled in a field behind a modest village house. Congratulations, you've discovered the peasant privy, but hold on before you take a seat. You might want to inspect it carefully. Because here's a fun fact, not every medieval toilet was still. Some buzzed, some hissed, and occasionally some bit back. Insects were constant companions. Flies swarmed the pit. Spiders built webs in the corners. Wasps found the warmth of a well-used outhouse strangely appealing. And then there were the rodents. Mice, sure, but rats, absolutely. There's even one account of a woman in 13th century Germany who was bitten by a rat while using the privy. She lived, but she refused to ever sit again. Who could blame her? This was the unspoken danger of sitting down in the medieval world. Privies weren't maintained with disinfectants or air fresheners. They were wooden shacks, often with warped doors, leaking roofs, and walls that leaned like they were too embarrassed to stand upright. Yet they were essential. Even the poorest households made room for one. And no matter how rough the construction people still preferred a rickety outhouse to wandering into the woods at midnight with only a candle and a prayer. These seats weren't comfortable either. A thin, splintery plank with a crudely carved hole, sometimes round, sometimes oval, sometimes oddly abstract, depending on who did the carpentry. No cushioning, no ergonomic curve, just wood, cold in the winter, hot in the summer, moist regardless. Peasants often repurposed materials, old barrels, worn planks, broken carts to build their outhouses, and they kept them far enough from the house to avoid the smell, but close enough to reach during emergencies. It was a delicate balance between convenience and consequence. And what did you find inside a typical peasant latrine, aside from the obvious, maybe a torch stub jammed into the wall, a bundle of dried herbs dangling overhead, and if you were especially lucky, a stick, not just any stick, a latrine stick, smooth, often whittled, used for scraping, sometimes reused, sometimes communal, sanitary, not in the least. But this was life. Wiping materials varied. Moss was common, especially in forested regions. Leaves worked, though not all leaves were safe. There are cautionary tales about people wiping with stinging nettle. Once, hay straw rags if you had access to old cloth that was considered a luxury. But cloth could also be washed and reused. So yes, you might find the same fabric in rotation for weeks, washed ideally. But standards were flexible. Historians still debate whether rural households regularly cleaned their privy pits or simply waited for them to fill. Some evidence suggests that waste was periodically shoveled out and used in gardens as fertilizer. Other evidence suggests it just sat and sat until time or rain or collective denial did the rest. Now let's talk about night, because using the outhouse in broad daylight was one thing, but after dark, whole different story. Most people didn't risk it, not because of rats, though they were bad enough, but because of folklore. You see, medieval peasants lived in a world thick with superstition. The privy wasn't just a toilet, it was a threshold, a place where evil spirits might gather. Some believed that demons crept into latrines at night, hiding in the shadows of the pit, waiting for vulnerable behinds to descend. A quirky tidbit: in certain regions, people painted protective symbols, runes, crosses, or even crude eyes on the inside of the outhouse door to ward off evil. Others kept iron nails near the seat, as iron was believed to repel spirits. There's even record of people reciting brief prayers before sitting down. And honestly, who could blame them? One legendary tale from rural Wales tells of a woman who swore a ghost grabbed her ankle while she was mid-squat. After that, she made her husband accompany her every evening, standing guard with a pitchfork while she finished. Yet despite all this, the bugs, the smells, the demons, people survived because they had to. The privy wasn't a luxury, it was a compromise, a muddy handshake between nature necessity and medieval ingenuity. So tonight, as you nestle under clean sheets and contemplate your next leisurely stroll to a pristine bathroom, take a moment to honor the brave souls who faced rats, weather, and wraiths just to relieve themselves with a shred of dignity. And if you ever find yourself time traveling to the 1300s, bring a flashlight and a second stick. You've made it inside the towering stone walls of a monastery. The air is still. Echoes of shuffling sandals and whispered prayers bounce gently off cool, shadowy corridors. And though it's a place of worship, of silent contemplation, of divine devotion, monks still have to poop. Yes, even the most pious among us must answer nature's call. And in a world where cleanliness was often confused with holiness, the medieval monastery had its own way of dealing with bathroom needs, quietly, systematically, and with a surprising touch of engineering genius. Enter the lavatorium. Now don't be fooled by the name. The lavatorium wasn't a toilet, it was the washing area. Typically a long stone basin, sometimes with flowing water, sometimes with just a few bowls and towels. Monks used it to cleanse their hands and faces before meals prayers, and yes, after bathroom breaks. Cleanliness was next to godliness, at least in theory. But where did they actually go? That would be the reredorer, also known as the dormitory latrine. Think of it as a long hall or attached structure, usually at the end of the sleeping quarters, with a bench running the length of it, and multiple drop holes cut into the stone. These weren't scattered randomly. They were evenly spaced clean relatively, and frequently flushed with diverted water from a nearby stream. Yes, monks had flushing toilets, sort of. Cistercian monasteries in particular were known for their advanced plumbing systems. They built complex water channels that ran beneath the reredorer, constantly moving waste away and reducing odor. Some scholars call it the first functional sewage system in Europe since the Romans. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Imagine this, a line of sleepy monks, brown robes bunched around their ankles, sitting in solemn silence over gently running water. No talking, no eye contact, just the occasional plop echoing down the channel. It's humble, it's holy, it's hygienic well for the time. The routine was strict: morning prayers at sunrise, communal meals in silence, and scheduled times for bathroom use. You didn't just get up and wander off. Monks followed a daily rhythm, and the call of nature had to fit within that divine choreography. And they weren't alone. Novices, young monks in training, were often assigned to clean the latrines. It was part of their spiritual discipline. Humility, after all, was best learned through the nose. Monks wiped with cloth or moss washed in the lavatorium and kept their habits, those long robes, in fairly decent condition. In fact, the monastic community probably had better hygiene practices than most medieval townspeople. Why? Because order mattered. Clean bodies supported clean souls. That said, accidents happened. There are letters and records describing blocked channels, cracked stones, and the dreaded overflow. One abbot in the 12th century wrote a complaint to a nearby bishop describing the invasion of smell from a broken waste channel that had turned the chapter house into a place of fragrant punishment. Repairs were ordered, fast. And here's a quirky fringe detail: some monks took their bathroom habits very seriously. There are preserved rules from certain monastic orders detailing exactly how one should sit on the latrine, how long was appropriate, and which prayers were acceptable to whisper while attending to one's business. One abbey even required monks to cross themselves before sitting down. Holiness in, holiness out. Historians still argue whether every monastery had such structured systems, or whether these were exceptions found only in wealthier orders. Some remote hermitages, after all, just dug holes and called it a day. But large monastic complexes, especially those built by Cistercians and Benedictines, show evidence of thoughtful design that prioritized sanitation. And you know what? It worked. These religious communities were less prone to some of the diseases that ravaged the outside world. Maybe it was the clean water, maybe it was the regular bathing, or maybe just maybe it was because they actually washed their hands. The lavatorium, in fact, was such a fixture of monastic life that it was often placed near the refectory, the dining hall, so monks could purify themselves before meals. It became a place of quiet ritual lined with carved stone basins and trickling spouts. In some monasteries, water ran constantly, an audible reminder of spiritual and physical cleansing. Of course, there were still complaints. Some monks grumbled silently about the cold stone seats, the drafts, and the occasional spider. Others wrote long treatises about the spiritual significance of bodily functions. Because when you're not allowed to talk all day, you write about your bathroom habits, apparently. One particularly poetic friar described the act of defecation as the daily expulsion of the earthly burden that which binds us to flesh. So yeah, even monks romanticized it. So tonight, as you settle under soft covers and the world quiets around you, imagine the cool stone halls of a monastery, the flicker of candlelight, the gentle rush of water beneath your feet, and a long bench where men in robes sit side by side, bound by faith and fiber. In the end, everyone has to go, even the holiest among us, and sometimes they just do it better. You're back on the road now, traveling through the rolling hills of medieval Europe. Maybe you're a merchant or a pilgrim, or just some poor soul trying to get to the next village before nightfall. But then it hits you, that familiar twinge in the gut, the signal from your body that regardless of where you are or how far you still have to go, this journey is going to make an unscheduled stop. Time to find a bush, a ditch, or anything remotely hidden. Because one thing is for sure, there are no public rest stops out here. For men, this situation was awkward but manageable. Cloaks provided cover. A tree, a rock, even a roadside shrine if you were feeling particularly sacrilegious. But for women, the situation was exponentially more complicated. The combination of long dresses, laced bodices, no undergarments, or too many layers of them, and zero privacy made going a strategic operation. And that's where gender really started to matter in medieval bathroom habits. Inside, homes men and women shared the chamber pots, but outside usage diverged. In cities, it was more common for women to relieve themselves discreetly behind the market stalls, behind taverns, or in courtyards. Some wealthier households had separate privies for ladies placed in more secluded garden areas. And while this might sound considerate, it was less about comfort and more about modesty. Because in the medieval mindset, female bodily functions carried extra baggage. There was a cultural belief, strong, widespread, and absolutely unfair, that women's bodily emissions were somehow more shameful, more unclean, and that meant women were often expected to be more discreet, more silent, and more careful about when and how they relieved themselves. Historians still argue whether this was a universal sentiment or more common in religious and elite circles. In peasant villages where everyone lived shoulder to shoulder and there were no secrets anyway, people were likely more pragmatic. But the gender divide was real. For example, in medieval legal codes across Europe, there were actual fines for women caught relieving themselves in public, not for men, just women. In some towns, the punishment included public shaming, which is incredibly ironic considering the streets were already covered in filth, a quirky workaround. Some women used urinettes, essentially funnels, made of leather or pottery that allowed them to pee standing up. Yes, medieval female urinals. There are archaeological findings of devices shaped like small pitchers, or tubes sometimes carried in pouches. They weren't common, but they existed, and their mere presence tells you just how inconvenient nature could be for women on the go. Inside wealthier households, this divide deepened. Lady of the house. You got a chamber pot with a lid sometimes, even a padded seat. Men used a basic pot or walked to the garderobe. Women's pots were often kept behind curtains or inside cabinets. They looked like furniture, because if people had to acknowledge that women used the bathroom, it needed to be at least disguised with a flourish of oak and brass. Even the language differed. Men relieved themselves. Women retired. Gentlewomen didn't go to the bathroom, they visited the necessary. This euphemism was passed down through centuries, eventually morphing into the Victorian powder room, because apparently we were all too delicate to say I need to poop, and menstruation, that was another layer of taboo altogether. Though not the focus of this section, it's worth noting that bathroom-related privacy was often tied to the management of monthly cycles, which were seen as mysterious, dangerous, or even evil in some religious texts. As a result, women were often encouraged to be invisible in all things related to bodily function. A fringe belief in 14th century Germany suggested that if a woman urinated while angry, her rage could curse the land she squatted on. A superstition? Absolutely. But it reinforces the anxiety medieval society had around female biology. This divide even extended to architecture. In some manners, the location of the privy, whether tucked into a back stairwell or placed in an outer courtyard, was decided based on who used it, and which gender could walk there without being seen. But despite the stigma, women adapted. They timed their bathroom breaks around meal times. They used communal privies during quieter hours. They developed hand signals and subtle phrases that everyone understood, and they raised daughters who learned how to be discreet even when nature was anything but. Still, the expectation of silence led to mishaps. A woman in York was once fined after she was caught using the alleyway behind a church. Her defense, she'd waited all day and simply couldn't hold it anymore. The court response, she should have planned better. History doesn't record whether the judges ever tried wearing 3 layers of wool skirts during a feast. Yet in all this absurdity, there's something deeply human. The fact that people tried to maintain dignity, comfort, and modesty, even in the most undignified situations. That women found ways to go despite every obstacle in front of and under them. So tonight, as you curl up and the hum of your bathroom fan whispers in the distance, take a moment to honor the medieval women who squatted behind hedgerows, steadied themselves in drafty stone rooms, and invented urinettes centuries before the world was ready. Because when modesty meets necessity, innovation always follows. You're standing in a quiet corner of a medieval herb garden. Bees are buzzing lazily lavender wafts on the breeze, and you're surrounded by greenery that looks charmingly rustic until you realize half of it has been gathered for a very specific, very personal purpose. That's right. It's not for cooking, it's for wiping. Toilet paper, as we know it, didn't exist in the Middle Ages, not even close. Instead, people turned to nature and whatever happened to be within reach to handle the aftermath of their daily business. And depending on your station, in life location, and level of desperation, your options varied wildly. For peasants, moss was king. Soft, plentiful, and relatively absorbent moss was nature's wet wipe. You'd scoop a handful from a tree trunk or shaded patch of earth, and if it wasn't already damp, you were considered lucky. Sure, it occasionally harbored bugs, but those were just bonus exfoliation, right? Leaves were common too, particularly large ones like dock or burdock. But there was a learning curve. Use the wrong plant, and you might find yourself dancing around a cottage fire with an unfortunate rash. Medieval medical texts include cautionary notes about fiery bottom, which sounds quaint until you realize it meant days of discomfort. Wiping was a gamble. Then there was straw, cheap, abundant, and blessedly disposable. But have you ever tried wiping with a straw bundle? It's not exactly gentle. Think of it as the Brillo pad of the medieval bathroom, a last resort that left its mark literally. And if you were desperate, smooth stones, twigs, scraps of linen if you could spare them. In coastal regions, seashells were used, though this was rare and only for the very brave. One monk in 1238 reportedly injured himself trying to use a scallop shell to great regret. The record ends there, but you can imagine. Now here's where it gets strange. In some monastic communities and wealthier homes, wiping was handled not with found objects, but with reusable cloth rags, often called clouts. These were washed, dried, and reused until they literally fell apart. In castles and manors, they might even be perfumed or soaked in vinegar before use. Practical, yes. Sanitary, debatable. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit that gets historians buzzing in parts of medieval China. Yes, far from our European setting, there's documented use of paper for toilet purposes by the 6th century. Yet it didn't make its way west. So while paper was around, your average medieval European was still squatting with a handful of weeds. And there's more. Certain herbs were believed to have medicinal properties when used during wiping. Sage, for instance, was thought to ward off hemorrhoids. Yarrow was considered antiseptic. People genuinely believed that using these plants could protect them from disease, or at least from imbalanced humors. It was medicine by moonlight. Of course, this led to some trial and error. In one preserved household ledger from a wealthy English estate, there's a purchase listed as a dozen wipe herbs. No one knows exactly what was included, but later pages mention the household physician being called for a rash most fierce. One can only assume someone got a bit too experimental. So where were these materials stored? In public latrines? You might find piles of straw moss bundles, or even shared cloths rinsed in buckets of vinegar. Yes, shared. People didn't love it, but again, standards were different. You grabbed the least wet clump and hoped for the best. In private homes, wiping tools might be tucked into small wooden boxes hung from a hook near the chamber pot, or simply placed on a windowsill in the privy. Some nobles even had little side tables beside the garderobe seat with wiping options displayed like a strange, disturbing charcuterie board. One of the most unusual tools, the gomp stick, a kind of paddle used to scrape rather than wipe. Smooth on one end, carved handle on the other. It was rinsed after use and hung by the door. Not particularly luxurious, but serviceable. Archaeologists have found them near Viking settlements, and even in parts of rural France. And speaking of scraping, some communal privies in towns kept shared scrapers washed hopefully between uses. In one infamous account from Bruges, a town council meeting was interrupted when a member accused another of hiding the preferred wiping stick. A brawl broke out. It made the local records. That's the power of personal hygiene. Historians still argue whether these tools were used daily or saved for special occasions like feast days or visits from in-laws. But one thing's certain, medieval people had to be inventive, and wiping was no exception. Every region, every household, every individual developed their own preferred method. You were loyal to your moss patch, you defended your rag pile, and if all else failed, you washed with water, using your hand. Yes, your hand. This wasn't uncommon. In some parts of southern Europe and the Middle East, people used a left-hand only method for personal cleansing, the right hand reserved for eating. It's a practice that survives in some cultures today, though, with soap and running water. Back then, just water and a prayer. So tonight, as your pillow softens and the last of your thoughts begin to fade, imagine the quiet rustle of leaves, the soft grip of moss in your hand, the dignity of scraping with a polished stick passed down through generations. It was rough. It was rustic. It was real. And thank goodness you live now. You're deep inside the royal chambers now. Velvet drapes hang heavy in the corners. Candlelight flickers across gold-framed tapestries. The air smells faintly of rosewater and cooked goose. And somewhere behind one of these carved doors, the king is sitting on his throne, not the political one, mind you, the other throne, because tonight you're meeting one of the most gloriously absurd figures in the entire history of medieval hygiene, the groom of the stool. Yes, that was his real title, and yes, it meant exactly what you think it does. This man, always a man, always noble-born, was charged with assisting the king in his most private bodily function. He didn't just hand over the cloth or open the window. He helped the monarch lower his trousers, made sure everything was situated, and even wiped when needed. The job required discretion, poise a steady hand, and the ability to look deeply serious while surrounded by the smell of royal stew. Now, before you cringe too deeply, here's the twist. The groom of the stool wasn't considered a joke. He was one of the most powerful courtiers in the entire royal household. Because think about it, if you're helping someone go to the bathroom, you're also hearing their secrets, their rants, their fears. You're there in the most unguarded moments. You become not just a servant, but a confidant. And kings took that trust seriously. Henry VIII's groom of the stool had enormous political influence, handling royal finances correspondence, and even access to the king. Historians still argue whether the power of the position grew from genuine competence or simply because no one else wanted to do it. But either way, the groom had the king's ear, sometimes literally. As for the stool itself, it was often made of padded wood with a velvet cushion and a central hole. Underneath sat a removable chamber pot, sometimes silver, sometimes porcelain, sometimes just plain ceramic. The whole contraption was portable, sometimes folded into a box or disguised to look like furniture. It traveled with the king on military campaigns, hunting trips, even pilgrimages. You'd see the groom carrying it respectfully behind the royal carriage like a holy relic of digestive destiny, and wiping that was handled with linen cloths, washed and perfumed. Paper was rare and too expensive. The process was deliberate, careful, and ideally silent. Imagine trying to preserve royal dignity while kneeling beside a man in a crown who's just had too much mead and mutton. But the job wasn't just about hygiene. The groom also monitored the king's health through his bowel movements. That's right medieval poop analysis. If the stool was too loose, too hard, too dark, or God forbid contained worms, it was noted. Sometimes it was sent to the royal physician, with a sample, in a box, and the groom. He'd report it like it was foreign policy. Your Majesty's humors are this morning most favorable, or there is concern of imbalance, sire, perhaps fewer blood puddings. The fate of the kingdom, it turns out, was sometimes tied to the consistency of breakfast's aftermath, a quirky fringe detail. In some records, the groom was given keys to the privy chamber, literally holding the keys to the king's poop room. Only he, the physician, and perhaps one trusted valet were allowed inside. In a way, it was a sacred space, a temple of bodily release, with velvet curtains. And it wasn't just England. Other courts had their own versions. In France, the valet de chambre served similar functions. In the Holy Roman Empire court, barbers and attendants might rotate through the role, though they never reached the same institutional prestige. Nowhere else quite celebrated this role the way the English Tudors did. Of course, it wasn't glamorous. One wrong move, one slip of the cloth or poorly timed curry, and your career could quite literally go down the drain. But if you played your role well, you gained proximity influence and rewards. Many grooms went on to become barons' advisors and lords in their own right, all because they knew how to clean a backside with grace. Still, the job faded over time. As sanitation improved and court etiquette became more distant, monarchs grew less inclined to share their most private moments. By the 18th century, the position had evolved into something more symbolic, more of a glorified personal secretary than royal bathroom buddy. But the name stuck. Groom of the Stool, a title that has outlived its function and continues to confuse high school students and historians alike. So tonight, as you lie in bed beneath the soft hum of plumbing and modern dignity, think of the man kneeling beside the throne, not a court jester, not a servant, but a trusted companion holding scented linen and the weight of royal secrets. Because when you rule a kingdom, you still need someone to have your backside. You're standing just outside a small timber-framed cottage, the kind with a thatched roof and smoke curling lazily from a crooked chimney. Inside, someone is stirring porridge. Chickens are squabbling nearby, and a toddler waddles barefoot across the packed dirt floor until suddenly they stop crouch and, well, you know where this is going. Welcome to peasant life, where running water is a luxury no one even dreams of, and when nature calls, it doesn't ask politely, it just happens. So what do you do when your house has no bathroom, your family sleeps in the same room, and your child is about to turn the corner from adorable to alarming? You improvise. In the medieval world, potty training was less about method and more about damage control. Peasant families didn't have colorful chairs or sticker charts. They had dirt floors, straw bedding, and a constant need to keep the smell down. So training was swift, unsentimental, and driven by sheer necessity. Parents taught their children to squat over a chamber pot if the family had one, if not a corner of the yard, a worn-out bowl, a pit behind the house, anything that could contain the moment and hopefully be dumped before breakfast. Toddlers learned quickly not because anyone explained it gently, but because accidents meant sleeping beside it, and no one wanted that. There were no diapers. Cloth was expensive. Washing was labor-intensive. Some mothers used swaddling bands, layers of linen tied around the lower body, which absorbed waste, but also became breeding grounds for infection if not changed regularly. Others simply let their children roam uncovered, especially in warm months, and cleaned them off with moss rags or a splash from the rain barrel. Yes, medieval parenting was gritty, wiping. If the child was lucky, a parent would help with moss or straw. More often, they were taught to do it themselves, early and enthusiastically. It wasn't about hygiene, it was about survival. The faster a child could manage their business without making a mess, the easier life became for everyone in the single-room household. And it wasn't just about toddlers. As children grew older, they learned the rhythms of outdoor life. Where to go, when to go, where not to go, especially if the neighbor's goat had claimed that spot. Going to the bathroom became part of daily chores, done quickly without fuss, and usually with a stick nearby. One for wiping, one for poking spiders. Quirky detail. In some regions, children were given privy charms, small trinkets, or carved wood figures believed to protect them while relieving themselves. Because the privy, as we've seen, was a place of danger. Rats' spirits, and the ever-present risk of falling in. A child lost in a latrine was a tragic but very real possibility. So families prayed. They blessed the privy. And sometimes they stood outside and sang softly until the child emerged. Historians still debate whether medieval people thought children were innocent or just miniature adults. But when it came to bathroom habits, kids were expected to learn fast and stay out of the way. Parents didn't have the time or the linens to deal with frequent accidents. And then there were the bedwetters. Oh, medieval life was not kind to them. Without waterproof bedding or laundry machines, a wet mattress was a crisis. Straw stuffing had to be removed and dried. Wool blankets had to be scrubbed and smoked over the hearth to kill the smell. Some parents responded with patience, others not so much. Bedwetting was often blamed on demon's diet or laziness. Remedies included herbal teas, charms under the pillow, or more questionably, a slap with a cold rag. None of these worked particularly well. One fringe theory from a 15th century Italian healer claimed that whispering a Latin blessing into a child's left ear before sleep would shut the waters of shame. It didn't, but at least it was nicer than the slap. In more superstitious households, children were warned never to go out alone at night, even to relieve themselves, lest the toilet spirits get them. A particularly ominous creature in Slavic folklore called the Javaronok was said to live in outhouse holes and snatch children who leaned too far forward. True, not likely. Effective potty training tactic, absolutely. By the time kids reached 6 or 7, they were expected to behave like adults in all things including bathroom routine. Boys learned to aim properly. Girls learned to manage their layers without falling over. And if you got it wrong, well, you cleaned it up yourself. That was the rule. So tonight, as you snuggle beneath soft sheets and reflect on modern luxuries like diapers, wipes, and scented powder, think of the peasant child crouched beside a root cellar, wiping with a leaf, proud to have missed their own shoes this time. Because in the medieval world, surviving childhood meant learning how to go with speed, with dignity, and with moss in your hand. You're walking past a sleepy village garden at dusk. The sun dips low, casting golden light on rows of cabbage turnips and something suspiciously greener than the rest. A man with a shovel is working the soil, humming to himself. But if you follow your nose, something smells off. That's because tonight's fertilizer isn't cow dung. It's something a little more human, Welcome to the strange, smelly, and surprisingly valuable world of night soil, a euphemism that sounds poetic, but literally means human waste collected and repurposed for agricultural use. You see, in the medieval world, nothing went to waste. Not food scraps, not ashes, and certainly not what came out the other end of dinner. While some waste was dumped, buried, or simply ignored, much of it was intentionally gathered, stored, and sold, yes, sold to farmers, eager for its powerful fertilizing properties. Why? Because manure was money. Human waste, like its animal cousin, was rich in nitrogen and phosphorus. These were essential nutrients for crops, and in a world without synthetic fertilizers, the options were limited. Night soil, especially when combined with ash and straw, helped fields grow fatter, cabbages hardier wheat, and shockingly robust leeks. Now, before you imagine medieval farmers joyfully scooping poop into baskets, let's talk logistics. In cities, gong farmers remember them hauled barrels of waste out of town under cover of night. They would dump it in designated fields or sell it directly to rural buyers. Sometimes it was mixed with compost, sometimes left to age red rot before spreading. The result was a potent blend that made even the stingiest soil yield something edible, but it came at a price, a very pungent price. Fields fertilized with night soil reeked. The smell clung to clothes, hair, and memory. There's a preserved letter from a 14th century abbess in France, begging a nearby farmer to cease the use of foul slurry upon the convent's barley, for the sisters find the air oppressive. The farmer declined, the barley thrived. And it wasn't just rural folks using the stuff. Walled towns often had designated middens, mounds of decomposing refuse, and feces used by urban gardeners to grow herbs and vegetables. These were communal and often managed by trade guilds. If you needed garlic and had a strong stomach, the midden garden was the place to go. One quirky tidbit: in some places, certain vintner families swore by night soil for grapevines. They believed it gave the wine a deeper flavor. Whether that's true is best left untested. But of course, there were risks. Spreading human waste on crops could and often did lead to disease outbreaks: typhoid, cholera, dysentery. The big three of medieval misery. People didn't know about bacteria, but they did notice that drinking from a well downhill of the cabbage patch had consequences. Historians still argue whether medieval folks made any effort to sanitize night soil. Some texts suggest they let it sit for months before using it. Others hint at herbal additives, lavender, thyme, even lime to reduce smell and danger. But more often the process was simple: collect, cart, dump, spread. Try not to vomit. Still, this trade had structure. In larger towns, you might find waste brokers, middlemen who negotiated between gong farmers and rural clients. Prices varied depending on the season, the distance, and the quality of the product. A cesspit behind a tavern, probably a rich blend. One behind a monastery, perhaps less diverse in content, but spiritually fortified. And people got territorial about their waste. In some London neighborhoods, households paid to have their cesspits emptied at night, and they expected that waste to stay local. There were even disputes when rival farmers tried to undercut deals by stealing night soil from city pits. One court record from York includes the phrase, "He did steal from the pit, not his own, and did flee with cart and bucket afore sun's rising." Yes, poop theft was a real crime. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about this trade. Church officials occasionally condemned the practice, arguing that it was unseemly to profit from what God had deemed waste. Others saw it as unsanitary, especially when the fields were close to town. But mostly people accepted it, because crops needed help, and nothing helped quite like the contents of last night's dinner. Some towns even instituted waste taxes, charging landowners for disposal and sale. If you owned land and used human waste, you paid a fee. The taxman knew what was in your pit. A fringe theory held that night soil from happy, healthy people made better fertilizer. So yes, some farmers got picky. They preferred waste from monasteries or noble houses. One old tale describes a farmer who refused to use gamblers' dung, believing it would cause his crops to grow crooked. So tonight, as you drift off with the smell of lavender and clean laundry in the air, think of the medieval farmer trudging into the field with a sloshing bucket and a strong sense of optimism. Because in the Middle Ages, growing food wasn't just about sun and soil, it was about guts, quite literally. You're standing at the edge of a crowded medieval street, fair juggling clowns roasted meat on spits, children chasing each other with sticks, and somewhere beneath all the laughter and lute music, an invisible menace lurks. Not a pickpocket, not a wolf, bacteria. Because behind the fun and noise behind the town walls and cottage fences, every privy chamber pot and dung-filled gutter was a potential breeding ground for illness. And yet most people had no idea. They blamed bad air, bad luck, or even bad behavior. But we know better. We know that lurking within every outhouse was an army of invisible pathogens. Tonight's journey, welcome to the diseases hiding in the loo. Let's begin with the classic trio: dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. These weren't rare. They were constant companions. The term flux appears again and again in medieval texts, the bloody flux being dysentery, which caused intense diarrhea, often laced with blood, and dehydrated victims until they collapsed. Typhoid brought fever and rash. Cholera, that was a full-body surrender, the kind of sickness that could empty your system and end your life within hours. And where did they thrive? In stagnant water, spoiled food, and yes, in human waste. Waste that often ended up near food, drink, and people. You can draw the lines yourself. Medieval towns were especially vulnerable. Water sources, wells, streams, and even rain barrels were often contaminated. Cesspits overflowed. Waste from chamber pots ran through the gutters. And when pigs roamed free, as they often did, they stirred everything into a muddy microbial soup. Historians still argue whether people had any real understanding of the link between waste and an illness. The idea of miasma, or bad air, dominated. People believed that foul smells carried disease, not the waste itself, just the odor. So they burned herbs, sprinkled rosewater, and clutched aromatic sachets to their noses. These didn't stop bacteria, of course, but they did make things more bearable. Ironically, miasma theories sometimes accidentally helped. By avoiding smelly places, people sometimes avoided infected ones. But not always. You could walk right past a bubbling gutter and feel fine, until your stew was made with water from the same source. And don't even get started on flies. They were everywhere, constant, buzzing from privy to meat stall, from dung heap to bakery shelf, carrying tiny gifts no one could see. Historians estimate that foodborne illness was one of the most common causes of death in the Middle Ages, especially for children. A quirky example. In 1388, the English Parliament passed a law forbidding waste dumping into rivers and public streets. This sounds promising, until you realize they did it not for health, but because the stench near Westminster was disturbing lawmakers during session. Even when outbreaks occurred, responses were inconsistent. Some towns quarantined houses, others blamed witches. Occasionally, whole neighborhoods were torched to stop the spread. There's a record from 1349 of a town in Bavaria that burned an entire slum, believing it to be the source of poison. The real source, A, shared privy pit and a contaminated well. Monasteries once again were ahead of the curve. Their organized privy systems and running water made them oases of cleanliness, relatively speaking. Some even built enclosed hand-washing stations with soap. Yes, soap made from ash and animal fat. Was it luxurious? No. Did it help? Probably. In cities, bathhouses offered some relief. Though not directly tied to toilet habits, regular bathing helped reduce surface grime. But once bathhouses became associated with sin and scandal, many were shut down. The result, a population that washed less, squatted more, and suffered endlessly. Here's a fringe theory that's gained traction. Some scholars believe that intestinal parasites like worms were so common they were considered normal. And honestly, they probably were. Without sanitation, with constant exposure to fecal matter, in water and food, most people had at least a few freeloading passengers. There are even remedies in medieval herbals for the belly serpents. Charming. What about the rich? Surely they avoided all this. Not quite. They had bigger homes, private garderobes, and better servants, but disease didn't care. Castles with cesspits beneath living quarters often stank terribly. And when those pits overflowed, and they did, the stench wafted through the halls like an invisible assassin. One record tells of a nobleman who moved his entire family to the countryside. For a month after the privy beneath the solar did belch forth its contents. And yet for all this risk, people went on. They laughed, they ate, they used moss, and moved their privies, and prayed they didn't catch the green sickness, because they had no other choice. But they weren't helpless. Medieval people did try to stay clean. They wiped benches, added straw to pits aired out their homes. In towns with strong leadership, waste was collected and moved away. Was it perfect? No, but it was effort. And sometimes effort meant survival. So tonight, as you wash your hands in warm water, dry them on a fresh towel, and flush away your worries with a porcelain swirl, take a moment to remember the peasant hunched beside a pit, the monk whispering a prayer before using the latrine, and the town doctor sniffing a chamber pot to diagnose the flux. Because when disease came from the very act of being human, surviving was an art, and the brush was made of moss. You're stepping into the stone nave of a grand medieval cathedral. Light spills through stained glass in red and gold, falling gently across cold flagstones and heavy incense in the air. The monks are chanting. The bells are tolling. It is a place of sanctity silence, and also, as it turns out, a place with very strong opinions about poop, because in medieval Europe, the church had something to say about everything, including your bathroom habits. You see, to the average medieval Christian, the body wasn't just a vessel, it was a battleground. Flesh versus spirit, clean versus unclean. And anything that came out of the body, especially from the nether regions, was considered not just unpleasant, but spiritually suspicious. Defecation was a reminder that you were mortal dirty, and most definitely not divine, which meant that going to the bathroom wasn't just a physical act, it was a theological moment. Clergy debated whether excessive bowel movements were a sign of gluttony. Did too much stew lead to too much sin? Was having regular healthy digestion a sign of a well-balanced soul? Or did it mean your humors were dangerously aligned with the earthy, lustful parts of existence? Historians still argue how much of this was actual doctrine versus the obsession of individual monks. But written records make one thing clear: the church monitored bodily functions with deep, sometimes hilariously intense concern. Take the penitential's handbooks for confessors. These included lists of sins and the appropriate penance: swearing 5 Hail Marys, stealing a chicken, a week of fasting, but relieving oneself in public view. That could mean weeks of penance, especially if it caused temptation or laughter. Yes, pooping in the wrong place could endanger your soul, and it wasn't just about where. When you went, it also mattered. Monks, for example, were expected to use the latrine only at designated times, usually after meals or before prayer. Sneaking off during scripture readings was frowned upon. A wandering bowel, as one abbot called it, was a sign of spiritual distraction. But it got stranger. In some religious communities, excessive cleanliness was considered prideful. Washing too often after using the privy vein, wiping with imported linen arrogant. One nun's diary confessed that she once reused a cloth out of humility, only to suffer a rash most grievous and a lesson from God. Ouch. There was also the fear of contamination, not just physical, but moral. Waste, after all, was seen as the ultimate corruption of the body. It was a proof that the flesh was impure. This belief echoed in sermons, artwork, and metaphors. Hell, for example, was often described as smelling of sulfur, rot, and filth. Because what better way to warn people than comparing eternal damnation to an unflushed latrine? Here's a quirky fringe tidbit. Certain saints were said to have transcended bodily needs altogether. Saint Simeon Stylites, who lived atop a pillar for decades, was rumored to have stopped producing waste entirely. Not likely. But the myth reflects a deep longing among believers to escape the physical, the dirty, the well-poopy. But for the rest of us, the bodily reality remained. And so church leaders created rules and rituals to keep things in line. Monasteries had designated latrine guardians. They ensured that facilities were clean stocked with moss or cloth and used with proper modesty. Confessions sometimes included bowel-related shame. And yes, there were prayers, quiet, whispered bathroom prayers, asking God to bless the body's function and maybe speed things along. Even architecture reflected this theology. Monastic latrines were often built away from the chapel, sometimes with covered walkways, so monks could reach them in silence and privacy. In some cases, latrines were considered so private that monks weren't allowed to speak while approaching or even make eye contact with one another inside. You went, you wiped, you left. No small talk. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas even wrote about digestion, though carefully. They debated whether Christ experienced normal bodily functions. Most agreed he did because he was fully human, but still they tried not to dwell on it. And let's not forget the sinner's side of things. Defecating in church, for example, an unthinkable crime. But it happened. Whether from illness, drunkenness, or blasphemy, there are multiple records of people relieving themselves in sacred spaces and being dragged out in chains. One poor soul in 1321 supposedly mistook a confessional for a privy. His penance a public whipping and 6 months of bread and water diet. Of course, not all church figures were so harsh. Some friars understood that people, even devout ones, occasionally had accidents. There's a warm letter from a 14th century monk to his niece comforting her after she soiled her dress during Mass. "The Lord made your bowels, child," he wrote, "and he does not forsake their calling." So tonight, as you drift gently into sleep, reflect on the strange comfort of modern privacy. No penance, no parchment scrolls tracking your fiber intake, no side-eye from the abbot if your footsteps echo toward the latrine during Vespers. In the end, even the holiest must squat. And that truly is divine equality. You step into a narrow, dimly lit chamber. The air is thick not with smoke, but with something more pungent, more earthy. Against one wall sits a chamber pot, against the other, a wooden stool with a hole in it. But it's what's above that catches your attention: bundles of dried herbs hanging from rafters, pots of fragrant oils on ledges, even a clay bowl filled with lavender beside the seat. Welcome to the medieval bathroom's attempt at ambiance, because as it turns out, medieval people didn't just live with the stink they fought back. In a world without air fresheners, candles that smell like cookies, or triple flush toilets, the battle against bad odors was constant. And it wasn't just about comfort, it was about health status and even spiritual well-being. Enter the world of smell as medicine. You see, the dominant theory of disease in the medieval era wasn't based on germs. It was based on humors, the idea that health came from balancing bodily fluids. One of the ways these humors were believed to get out of balance: exposure to corrupt air, or in simpler terms, bad smells. This belief, known as the miasma theory, dominated medieval thinking. People thought foul odors caused illness, not bacteria, not viruses, just smells. If a place stank, it was dangerous. If it smelled fresh and herbal, much safer. So every medieval home had its own scent strategy, especially when it came to the privy. People hung sachets of herbs near toilet seats, rosemary, sage, rue, and especially lavender. They sprinkled dried petals into chamber pots, hoping it would mask the smell of human waste. Wealthier households even hired attendants to burn fragrant resins like frankincense or myrrh near latrines. A quirky detail. In some castles, nobles installed sweet boxes near garderobes, small compartments filled with dried herbs and spices that slowly released pleasant odors. Think of it as the original potpourri. Some even placed hot coals underneath to help diffuse the aroma throughout the room. It didn't always work. Let's be clear, no amount of lavender can mask a week's worth of chamber pot neglect. But it helped, and it gave people the sense that they were doing something, which in a time of frequent illness was a comfort in itself. In monasteries, lavatoriums, and reredoors often included herbal gardens just outside, not only for medicine, but to provide a constant supply of odor-fighting greenery. Sprigs of mint were rubbed on walls, juniper berries were boiled nearby. In one French abbey, records describe a fragrance keeper, a monk assigned to maintain the sense of communal spaces, a holy nose, if you will. And then there was the more proactive approach. Some people believed that the best way to keep the privy smelling sweet was to counter-stink it. Enter the world of medieval's fumigation. Burning feathers, dried dung, or even animal fat created clouds of dense smoke that somehow were thought to choke the bad air and reset the balance. It's unclear whether this was more effective than just opening a window, but it sure made people feel like something mystical was happening. Even the construction of latrines reflected the obsession with smell. Garderobes were often placed on the windward side of castles, so the prevailing breeze could carry odors away from the great hall. Doors were installed with gaps for airflow, and in some grand homes, toilet towers were built multi-level structures with vertical shafts that vented the stench straight into the sky. And still it wasn't enough. Which brings us to the final frontier, personal perfume. Since you couldn't always escape the smell, you tried to outsmell it. Nobles carried pomanders, small metal, or ivory balls filled with fragrant substances. They were worn on belts, hung from necks, or clutched during particularly offensive moments. Think of it as holding a scented stress ball every time you use the loo. A popular blend, ambergris, yes, that's whale vomit, crushed rose petals, cinnamon, and clove. It was expensive, potent, and surprisingly long-lasting. And if you were rich enough, you didn't leave your chamber without it. In cities, apothecaries sold sachets for home use. These were stuffed into shoes, sewn into cloaks, or hidden under mattresses. One record from a London household inventory includes 2 lavender pouches, 1 sage bundle, and a box of scented ash for the pot. Even common folk got creative, hanging onion skins, placing sprigs of pine, chewing mint before entering a privy just to trick their brains. And in a particularly memorable account from Flanders, a family lined their privy seat with goose feathers, believing the downy rim would trap bad smells. It didn't. Historians still argue whether any of this made a real difference, or if it was mostly wishful sniffing. But the effort was real. Medieval people were nose-aware, and in a world where hygiene was limited, scent was a powerful social and medical tool, because to smell good was to be healthy. To smell bad, that could mean illness, poverty, sin. So tonight, as you drift into peaceful sleep, breathing in the crisp scent of laundered sheets, or perhaps a faint vanilla candle nearby, spare a thought for the woman who sat down on a cold wooden seat, clutching a pouch of thyme in one hand and a feather in the other, hoping, praying that this time the smell wouldn't win. Because in the Middle Ages, the nose always knew. You've just finished your evening meal, a slab of coarse bread, a chunk of salted fish, and a goblet of warm flat ale. The fire in the hearth is low, your belly's full, and your eyelids are heavy. But just as you begin to drift into that satisfying medieval post-dinner stupor, a sudden rumble in your gut interrupts, loud, urgent, and as you sit up with a groan, you realize you're not alone. It's bathhouse night, and everyone else in town ate the same stew. Because in the Middle Ages, bathhouses weren't just for bathing. They were centers of community gossip, medicine, and occasionally bowel disasters waiting to happen. Let's set the scene. In towns across Europe, especially during the early and high medieval periods, public bathhouses were surprisingly common. Men and women bathed together in some regions, separately in others. You'd pay a small fee, strip down, and enter a steamy chamber with tubs, benches, or even small pools. Water was heated in giant cauldrons and mixed to temperature. There was soap of a kind made from animal fat and ash. There were attendants who offered towels, razor work, or even massages. And yes, there was ale, lots of it, which leads to our situation. You, like many bathers, have relaxed your body to the point of betrayal. Something you ate or drank is staging a revolt, and now you face a dilemma. Do you dash to the privy attached to the bathhouse, if there is one, or do you try to play it cool and excuse yourself without making a scene? Because here's The not-so-secret truth, bathhouses were notorious for digestive mishaps. With all the relaxation, warm water, flowing drinks, and lack of clothing, the body took liberties. In fact, there are records from towns like Lübeck and Ghent describing bathhouse incidents so frequent that some bathers began bringing their own wiping cloths just in case. One bathhouse in Prague kept a privy ladle on hand. If you don't want to know what it was used for, trust your instincts. And yes, bathhouses had attached latrines. Sometimes they were decently maintained brick seats over running water cleaned daily. Other times, they were glorified holes behind a curtain. The worse the economy, the worse the smell. Still, people loved the bathhouse. It was a break from the grind. You could sit in hot water, soak your sore feet, share stories with your neighbors, and if you had the coin, enjoy some extra services. Bathhouses developed reputations. In many towns, they became places of flirtation, assignation, and eventually moral panic. Clerics railed against them. Too much bathing, they said, invites sin. Some claimed the steamy air aroused the flesh. Others warned that bathhouses encouraged immodesty, and by extension, impure digestion. Yes, even digestion got pulled into the church's critique. A loose gut was seen as the consequence of loose morals. And yet bathhouses persisted. A quirky fringe fact. In southern Germany, some bathhouses kept a bathroom rooster. It wasn't for meat. It was a live bird placed in a cage near the privy door. When someone entered, the rooster squawked. Why, so others could avoid walking too close. A living squawking privacy alarm. But bathhouses weren't just about relaxation. They were health centers too. Barbers worked from them. Healers offered herbal remedies. And for many, they were one of the few places where you could sit, undress, and actually assess your body. That strange rash, that unhealed sore, a bathhouse, was where you noticed it and hopefully had someone nearby who knew what to do. And for those struggling with constipation or stomach ailments, bathhouses offered the medieval solution, beer and laxatives. One popular bathhouse cocktail included hot ale mixed with fennel and a dash of goose fat. Effective? Oh yes, and frequently regrettable. There's a preserved letter from a 15th century merchant in Nuremberg complaining that after a bathhouse treatment, he spent 3 hours in great contemplation seated upon the wooden throne and missed my supper entirely. He later revised his opinion, noting, but I do feel light of spirit. Bathhouse attendants. Those hard-working souls bore the brunt of this. They mopped, they scrubbed, they poured vinegar along the benches and burned bundles of juniper to clear the air. Some wore herbal amulets around their necks, not for fashion, but to dull the smell. A good bathhouse worker had a strong back, a strong stomach, and a stronger sense of humor. And then there were the bathhouse legends, tales of men slipping in puddles of their own making, of women fainting from the combined smells of lavender oil and something more sinister, of fights breaking out over towel theft, only to end in both parties realizing they'd soiled the same bench. Historians still debate whether bathhouses were the great hygienic advancement or just another cesspool of disease. Probably both. They improved cleanliness, yes, but they also spread infections when water wasn't changed and tools weren't cleaned. One outbreak of boils in 1319 was blamed squarely on the shared sponges of the West bathhouse. So tonight, as you stretch beneath warm sheets, your belly full and your bath private and uneventful, think of the medieval bather, relieved, relaxed, and occasionally betrayed. Because in the Middle Ages, Even a simple soak could turn into a soggy saga. You're walking through the cobbled heart of a bustling medieval city when something strange tickles your nose. It's more than the usual street stew horse droppings and smoky hearth fires. No, this is worse. It's rank. It's everywhere. It's the Great Stink. No, not the 19th century London one you may have heard about. This is the original medieval version, less famous, just as foul and utterly unforgettable. Let's talk about the epic sanitation failures of the Middle Ages. Medieval towns grew fast, too fast. Populations doubled, sometimes tripled in the span of a generation. More people meant more food, more trade, more houses crammed together, and exponentially more waste. But waste management didn't scale with population. There were no sewer systems, no standardized street cleaning, and definitely no coordinated dump trucks. Instead, there were cesspits, gutters, chamber pots, moats, and the occasional divine intervention in the form of rain. That was the plan. And when the weather didn't cooperate, things got thick. The city of York in 1326 suffered one of the worst recorded sanitation breakdowns in its history. According to chroniclers, an unusually dry summer left the city's drainage ditches stagnant. The refuse from thousands of residents, a human and animal alike, accumulated in alleyways under homes and along the edges of the central market. The stench became so unbearable that the mayor ordered perfume-soaked linen to be hung in public offices. One particularly dramatic monk recorded that Satan himself must have fled the city on account of the smell. Whether that's historically accurate or just creative writing, we'll never know. People vomited in the streets. Visitors turned back at the gates. Livestock collapsed from heat and rot exposure. And finally, when the city fishmonger dropped dead mid-sail, his nose supposedly overcome, something had to be done. City officials gathered. There were plans to fine waste-dumping residents, to clear the gutters to designate filth zones. But who would clean it? Enter the emergency gong farmers. Extra crews were hired, paid triple, offered meals and lodging. They waded into piles that hadn't been touched in months, shoveling by torchlight, gagging and praying with every scoop. Barrels were carted outside the city walls and dumped into old quarries' swamps, and when no one was looking, someone else's farmland. A quirky fringe moment from that summer. To bless the cleanup, a local priest walked through town swinging a censer filled with burning frankincense. It didn't help the smell, but it did keep the cleanup crew from quitting. Historians still argue whether the Great Stink of York was truly unique or just the best documented case. But similar breakdowns happened in Paris, Florence, and Bruges, especially during times of war or festival when city populations surged and infrastructure collapsed. The worst part, these outbreaks didn't just stink, they killed. The stagnant waste became breeding grounds for disease, cholera, dysentery, typhus. Flies swarmed, rats thrived, and people began to connect the dots, though not quite correctly. They still blamed bad air, not the waste itself, so instead of digging drains, they burned more incense. Some cities tried more radical solutions. In Prague, officials ordered that all chamber pots be fitted with lids and sealed with wax at night. It worked for about a week until people started using the river again. In Florence, a law was passed that assigned street guardians to every block. Their job patrol the alleys and report residents who dumped waste improperly. This led to a black market of poop removal where dishonest gong farmers would take payment and dump the waste in secret, sometimes back into the neighborhood. And in London, a particularly bold move was attempted the creation of a central waste canal. Dug by hand lined with stone, it was meant to channel waste from the center of town to the Thames. Unfortunately, it overflowed during the first heavy rain and flooded several bakeries. The city spent the next decade pretending it had never happened. Still, these disasters pushed some progress. Cities began designating official dump sites. Market stalls were moved away from drainage ditches. Privy regulations were enforced more regularly. Not perfectly, but more than before. A quirky, almost comedic response came from a small English village that, in the wake of its own local stink, issued nose veils, little cloth pouches filled with vinegar-soaked petals. Residents were encouraged to wear them when walking outdoors, a medieval precursor to gas masks and possibly the beginning of fashionably scented neckwear. But the root problem remained more people, plus no plumbing. Eventual disaster. And yet they endured. They endured the flies, the heat, the walls stained dark by waste, the permanent stink that clung to clothes to bread to memory. They endured because they had to, because everyone stank, and because tomorrow someone still needed to sell turnips. So tonight, as you take one last trip to your pristine tiled bathroom toilet paper, stacked neatly fan humming softly, think of the town crier, shouting "Hold your breath" as he sloshes through a street that squishes. Because before sewers came the stench, and in 1326, the stench won. You're trudging through the muck outside a military encampment, the kind hastily assembled in a field that was until yesterday home to nothing but sheep and silence. Tents flap in the wind, men sharpen blades or huddle over fire pits, and somewhere between the rows of pikes and piles of bread crusts, there's a far more urgent problem, where do thousands of soldiers go to the bathroom, welcome to the gritty, often forgotten, but absolutely crucial part of every medieval campaign waste management on the battlefield. Because whether you were a knight in shining armor or a barefoot levy with a borrowed spear, you still had to go. And when you're miles from a town camped with hundreds or even thousands of others, things get messy, fast. Let's start with the basics. Armies dug latrine trenches, sometimes called siege pits or scoff holes. These were long, narrow ditches dug downhill and downwind of the main camp. Ideally, they were covered partially with planks or simple boards with holes. Realistically, most were open pits with little more than a privacy curtain, if that. You used it. You buried it. You moved on, except when you didn't. See, during long campaigns, especially during sieges, armies stayed in one place for weeks or months, and over time those trenches filled up. When new ones weren't dug, or old ones weren't covered properly, disaster struck. Waste contaminated water sources, flies multiplied, and disease followed. Historians note that more soldiers in medieval wars died from illness than from wounds. Dysentery, typhoid, and camp fever were rampant. One chronicler of the 100 Years' War described a French siege camp as a place where a man might find both death and dung in every breath. And it wasn't just the foot soldiers. Knights wore armor. Armor was heavy, complicated, and not designed with bathroom breaks in mind. If nature called during a skirmish, or worse, a siege ladder climb, you had limited options. Some accounts describe knights relieving themselves directly into their leggings, then cleaning up afterward, as if rusted chainmail wasn't uncomfortable enough. One fringe tale, likely apocryphal, tells of a German knight whose squire invented a battle privy by sewing a flap into the knight's armor trousers. It worked until the knight forgot to close it and caught a crossbow bolt in a very personal area. Even commanders weren't spared. Generals and kings had portable chamber pots, often carried in chests by personal servants. These weren't used in the heat of battle, of course, but rather in their tents, an attempt at dignity in a world of stench. Some pots were metal, some ceramic, and one English noble had his engraved with the family crest. Because why not a quirky historical moment during the siege of Jerusalem in 1099? Crusaders who had run out of water were forced to boil and reuse their own urine, not just to drink, but to clean wounds. There are reports of entire units losing combat effectiveness because they were too ill from contaminated conditions to stand. Still, armies adapted. Some used ash and sand to cover latrine pits and reduce smell. Others burned waste in large open pits, though this posed its own hazards. One medieval army reportedly lost several tents when a dung fire got out of control and lit an ammunition cart. The irony of being blown up by your own bathroom was not lost on the survivors. And then there was the siege toilet paradox. During a siege, the besieged, those trapped in castles or towns, often had better sanitation. Many had internal garderobes, waste shafts, or hidden tunnels that allowed them to dispose of waste discreetly. The attackers meanwhile camped in the mud, outside rapidly surrounded by their own filth. In several cases, defenders simply waited for the enemy to get sick and die. Siege strategy by sewage. Brutal, effective. But let's not forget the human side of this. When you've marched for days, slept in a damp tent, and eaten nothing but hard biscuits and salted pork using a trench in full view of your comrades isn't exactly ideal. Soldiers developed habits, waiting until night walking farther than ordered, or if desperate, using their helmets not recommended. Privacy was minimal, shame was optional, and modesty forgotten. Yet even here, in the middle of battlefield chaos, people tried to bring order. Some units appointed waste wardens, soldiers assigned to dig new pits and keep the existing ones from overflowing. It was a thankless job, but one that could mean the difference between holding the line or being buried under the weight of your own logistics. So tonight, as you lie in comfort, with clean sheets and a flush nearby, think of the medieval soldier stepping carefully between trenches, in the dark armor, clanking torch, sputtering, trying to find a spot that isn't already occupied. Because in war, there were 3 guarantees: fear, hunger, and the eternal inevitable call of the bowels. And no one king knight or camp cook got out of that battle clean. You're crouched over an oak table in a smoky hall, poring over a strange-looking blueprint. No, it's not a plan for a castle or siege tower. It's a sketch of something far more daring, a flushing toilet. In the 15th century, wait, what? Yes, believe it or not, some medieval minds invented toilets far ahead of their time designs that included water flow, waste separation, and even mechanisms that flushed. But as with so many bright ideas, these brilliant contraptions were either misunderstood, underfunded, or flat out ignored. Tonight, you're about to meet the toilet innovations that came too early. Let's begin with a woman ahead of her time, Queen Elizabeth of York. In the late 15th century, she allegedly commissioned a flushable seat that could channel waste away from the royal chambers. Details are scarce, but records mention a flowing sluice lined with stone angled downward into a moat. Was it advanced plumbing? Not quite, but it was better than a bucket. Then there's Sir John Harrington, often called the godfather of modern flushing. Yes, his famous device, the Ajax, technically arrived in the late 16th century. But even before him, inventors had tinkered with the idea of using gravity and water to move waste. In monastic communities, especially among the Cistercians, architects built multi-tiered latrines with fresh spring water diverted through stone channels. The waste flushed away naturally. It was a simple, sustainable system, one we still admire today. But here's the problem. These ideas didn't spread. Why? First, because good plumbing was expensive. Carving stone channels, diverting water sources, and building raised seating required materials and labor most communities simply couldn't afford. When your town could barely fix the thatch on the mill, installing a marble poop chute was not a priority. Second, because comfort was suspicious. In a deeply religious era, too much pleasure, even from a warm, dry privy, was seen as indulgent. Why build a luxurious latrine when saints like Simeon Stylites were peeing off the side of a pillar for the glory of God? There's even a letter from a bishop warning that those who love comfort at the seat shall be soft of spine in all things. Toilet shame institutionalized. Still, innovations kept popping up. In Islamic cities like Baghdad and Cordoba, advanced sanitation thrived. Scholars there described water-flushed latrines, piped sewage systems, and even public bathhouses with built-in drainage. These weren't just ideas, they worked. But despite occasional contact through trade or conquest, Europe was slow to adopt them. One quirky footnote. In 14th century Norway, an inventor named Erik Snorreson built a rotating seat with a pulley system to drop waste directly into a sealed wooden tank. It worked brilliantly for 2 weeks. Then the pulley jammed, the tank overflowed, and Erik was banned from building any seat bench or box ever again. Truly a tragic ending for the medieval Thomas Crapper. Even in the rural corners of Europe, peasants experimented. Some dug dual pits beneath their outhouses, one active one composting. Every year they switched. It was basic composting theory. Brilliant. But with no way to promote the idea beyond their fence line, the concept vanished into the soil. Historians still debate whether widespread flushing toilets could have changed the trajectory of European health. Could earlier adoption have reduced plagues-controlled cholera? Maybe, but at the time the very idea of using fresh water to carry away waste seemed wasteful. Water was sacred. You drank it, you cooked with it, you baptized babies in it. Dumping dung into it felt like sacrilege, and yet pockets of brilliance shone. Some castle architects designed sloped garderobes that let gravity do the work, channeling waste out of the wall and into distant pits. In Italy, some noble homes featured hand-pumped water systems that rinsed privies from above. These weren't everyday features. They were experimental, ambitious, and often forgotten once the architect died or the patron ran out of gold. Why didn't it catch on? Because comfort wasn't the goal. Containment was. People wanted the waste gone, not in a mechanical sense, but in a metaphysical one. Out of sight, out of mind, buried, tossed, flung. The very idea of engineering a toilet felt to many like overthinking something everyone just lived with. And so, the innovations gathered dust. Sketches were shelved. Tinkering nobles were laughed at. The man who invented a crank-operated chamber pot in 1451, his wife refused to use it. too much noise, she said. So tonight, as you sit on your comfortable porcelain seat, tap a button to flush and walk away with clean hands and zero regret. Spare a thought for the forgotten inventors, the dreamers who tried to build a better throne but were told to sit down and shut up. Because in the Middle Ages, the future of toilets was already here. It just didn't stand a chance. You're standing outside a modest timber-framed home on the edge of a medieval village. Smoke drifts lazily from the chimney chickens, peck at the dirt, and from within, you hear a familiar sound, a child giggling, followed by the scolding tone of a tired mother. You peek inside and see something every parent dreads, but knows too well, a small guilty face standing next to a puddle. Welcome to the world of medieval potty training part 2, this time with extra drama and a lot more yelling. In the modern world, potty training is full of songs, books, and sticker charts. In the medieval world, it was more like sink or stink. Once a child could walk, they were expected to learn where to go, when to go, and most importantly, not to go near the hearth, which happened more often than anyone would like to admit. Parents taught through repetition and occasionally sheer panic. Children were taken outside, held over chamber pots, or if you were in a colder climate, over a wooden slop bowl that was emptied every morning, hopefully. The training tools moss-stern looks, and in some cases tiny wooden potties carved out of scraps and passed down from sibling to sibling. And yes, they had accidents, lots of them. Without diapers, cloth, or otherwise, toddlers spent much of their early years in long linen shirts with nothing underneath. This gave rise to a very specific parent reflex, the quick scoop. You hear a grunt, see a squat, and before the first drop hits the dirt floor, you're racing for the pot like your dignity depends on it. Because quite honestly, it does. Households with a bit more money might own several chamber pots, one for adults and one smaller designated just for children. These training pots were often set near the hearth to keep the chill off. Unfortunately, the warmth also encouraged use at the wrong time, turning some training pots into boiling stink bombs. Still, this wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about survival. Waste, if left untended, meant illness. And so children were taught early. You go outside, or in the pot, or in the trench. Nowhere else. Ever. Historians still debate the age at which children were considered potty independent. Some sources suggest that by age 3, a child was expected to handle their business with minimal supervision. Others claim that even 2-year-olds were being scolded for not aiming properly. There are no medieval parenting manuals, but a few household account books mention fines for servants who failed to clean up after the Lord's children. That says enough. Here's a quirky example. In 1442, a mother in Lincoln wrote in her will that her youngest son Thomas shall receive the small chamber pot of polished tin, for he hath made good use of it, and soiled but thrice. A glowing review, if ever there was one. And let's not forget the nighttime challenge. No one wants to stumble through a pitch-dark cottage with only a candle and a full bladder. Children were encouraged to go before bed, or risk having to wake the entire family. Some were so terrified of missing the pot that they simply didn't go at all, leading to bedwetting, another common and not so gently addressed issue. What did parents do? In some homes, bedwetters slept on straw mats instead of the family mattress. In others, they were made to help clean their mess with vinegar and cloth. And in truly stern households, children were told scary tales of spirits who haunted wet sleepers. One such legend in Wales warned of a ghost named Sir Dreep, who appeared only when the bed was soaked and whispered embarrassments until dawn. A fringe detail. In certain parts of the British Isles, children were given rhyme-based cues to remind them when to go. One went, "When the rooster crows and the hearth is warm, take thy pot, do no harm." It sounds cute until you remember the rooster crows at 5 in the morning. Wake up or wet the wool. But for all the discomfort, children did adapt. They watched their older siblings. They copied the adults. And gradually, with encouragement, threats, and enough moss to last a lifetime, they got the hang of it. And once they did, so it was celebrated, not with stickers or gold stars, but with something much better, trust. You could now be sent to the field without fear. You could attend festivals without shame. You were in the eyes of your family a functional person. So tonight, as you rest easy in a clean bed, the hum of a bathroom fan in the distance, think of the medieval toddler in a drafty stone cottage, clutching a wooden chamber pot and proudly declaring they made it through the night dry. Because every age has its milestones. Some just happen to be mossy. You're stepping through the side door of a medieval manor house, and the air shifts. Not the cold draft you felt in the great hall, but something else, an earthy heaviness, the kind that settles low in your nose and lingers. You've just walked past the servants' quarter and the waste trench, a familiar combo. Because in this household, as in so many others, toilets were more than a convenience, they were a symbol of power. Welcome to the privy as a power move. You see, in the medieval world, owning land meant owning rights. Rights to wood, to water, to grazing fields, and yes, to where people pooped. It wasn't glamorous, but it was control. And the further up the social ladder you climbed, the more sophisticated and segregated your toilet experience became. Let's start with the basics. Peasants had holes, shared trenches, outhouses if they were lucky. These were communal, usually built outside, and often just far enough from the house to keep the flies down, but not so far that you had to sprint at midnight. But if you were wealthy, you had a private garderobe or even a multi-seater latrine complex. Some lords had toilet towers built off the sides of their manors with vertical chutes that emptied into cesspits below. Others had dedicated necessarium chambers, a polite way of saying the good bathroom for guests and family only. And just as a moat kept attackers out, a garderobe separated you from the filth, literally and figuratively, because for the nobility not having to deal with your own waste was a badge of class. You didn't carry your chamber pot. You didn't empty it. You certainly didn't clean the seat. That was someone else's job. The further you were from your own byproducts, the higher your status. Historians still debate whether garderobes were more about sanitation or symbolism. They weren't very effective at waste disposal after all. But what they did do was demonstrate authority. You had a room, sometimes 2 rooms, devoted to a single bodily function. That was wealth. But here's where it gets strategic. Landowners controlled access to latrines. In tenant villages, the lord might own the only enclosed privy in the area and charge to use it, or require that waste from tenant homes be collected and dumped in pits on his land, which were then used to fertilize his fields. If that sounds a little manipulative, it's because it was. Control over waste meant control over sanitation, and sanitation meant survival. During outbreaks of disease, the lord who could manage his estate's filth had a better chance of keeping his people and himself alive. This wasn't just hygiene. This was political leverage. Quirky side fact. Some estates even had privy maps, crude floor plans marking the location of every pit chute and chamber pot station on the grounds. One surviving example, from a 14th century manor in Sussex, includes little drawings of buckets with smiling faces. Either the steward had a sense of humor or someone in the scriptorium got bored. But it didn't stop at property. Royal palaces took the game even further. Kings and queens had elaborate toilet arrangements, not just for comfort, but for display. A well-kept privy chamber was part of courtly image. Servants in charge of the royal bathroom, like the groom of the stool, wielded tremendous influence. If you controlled the toilet, you controlled time access and information. And yes, some nobles took pride in their setups. One eccentric baron in northern France built a relieving rotunda, a circular room with velvet-lined benches, stained glass windows, and a constant flow of water beneath. Guests were invited to admire it. One visitor described it as a throne of reflection where matters of both belly and kingdom might pass. Subtle, but even outside the upper crust, people understood the message of the privy. Owning your own chamber pot was a step up. Having it made of pewter instead of clay, a statement. Keeping it in a cabinet instead of under the bed, absolute sophistication. In towns, wealthier merchants built indoor privies, some even connected to rudimentary drainage. And guess what they told people? In wills, in gossip, even in wedding negotiations, having a clean private place to attend to nature was a selling point. A particularly bold bridegroom in 1397 included the phrase, "And to provide my wife a chamber with a door and a stool that shall be hers alone for her comfort and honor." Romance lives in strange places, but power cuts both ways. Servants who misused the Lord's toilet, sat without permission, failed to clean it, or were caught eavesdropping outside could be fined, demoted, even dismissed. Because the bathroom wasn't just a necessity, it was a sanctuary, a meeting place, a status symbol. And then there's the final irony. When nobles fell from power, one of the first things they lost wasn't the land or titles. It was control over waste. Banished to exile or reduced to common status, they suddenly found themselves doing what they'd once delegated, hauling their own pots, digging their own pits, from throne to trench, quite literally. So tonight, as you rest comfortably in your own space, a flush away from clean hands and forgotten messes, remember the medieval landowner admiring his private tower of relief. He may not have had indoor plumbing, but he did have control, and in his world that meant everything. You're standing in the shadow of a medieval town's stone wall just after dawn. The sun is beginning to rise. Merchants are arranging their carts, and a few bleary-eyed residents are making their way toward the edge of town, some with baskets, others with buckets, and one woman clutching a small wooden seat with handles. You're watching a routine that played out daily quietly and without much fuss, the dawn procession to the edge of civilization, all in service of the great unspoken tradition of public pooping beyond the walls. Because for many medieval townsfolk, especially the poor who lived in cramped quarters, without privies, going to the bathroom often meant going outside the city altogether. Let's set the scene. Within the walls, space was precious. Houses were packed tight alleys, narrower than your outstretched arms. There were few, if any, dedicated toilets for the lower classes. Chamber pots overflowed cesspits, were expensive to dig, and public latrines, if they existed, were often foul, overcrowded, or located in areas considered unsafe at night. So what did people do? They walked. They left the town gates, or crossed a field or ditch, and did their business where the city's control gave way to nature. These places earned nicknames: the Morning Meadow, Piss Lane, the Dropping Ground. Everyone knew where they were. Everyone knew why people went there. No one talked about it. And while it might sound undignified, this practice had its logic. The open air helped disperse odors. Rain cleaned up most of the mess, and animals, wild dogs, pigs, crows, often assisted with the, disposal. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. In fact, many cities had unofficial toilet zones outside the gates, used by residents for centuries. These were sometimes marked by stones hedges or the worn footpaths of generations. One city in southern France even had a relief tree, a gnarled old oak with branches twisted from centuries of being leaned on. Historians still debate whether towns officially acknowledged these areas or simply pretended they didn't exist. A few records suggest fines for those caught squatting too near the gate, but more often, authorities looked the other way, literally. Of course, this system wasn't perfect. Winter made things complicated. Walking a half-mile in the snow with your robe hiked up and your chamber pot clinking was miserable and dangerous. Some people slipped, others froze. There's one tragic and admittedly absurd tale of a man found encased in ice trousers down halfway through his business. He was mourned, briefly. And then there were the dangers after dark. Wolves, thieves, and wandering drunks were all known hazards. One merchant's wife in York carried a wooden staff with a bell on it, ringing it as she walked outside the walls at dawn, both to announce her presence and to ward off anything human or otherwise that might lurk in the shadows. A quirky detail. Some families made toilet cloaks, heavy hooded garments with slits that allowed you to squat without full exposure. They were handed down like heirlooms. A good toilet cloak kept you warm, covered your dignity, and doubled as a blanket when not in use. Function met form. Yet despite the inconvenience, the act of going outside was social. Groups of women might go together at dawn, chatting quietly, gossiping as they walked toward the same tree line they'd used since childhood. Children often followed their parents, learning the unwritten rules, where to step, where not to step, and how to avoid eye contact if someone else was already posted. And let's not forget the etiquette. If someone was already squatting in the best spot, perhaps a nice grassy knoll or a wind-sheltered hollow, you didn't interrupt. You turned, coughed, maybe offered a God give you peace, an oddly polite blessing for such a moment, and found your own patch. No eye contact. No questions. Some people brought buckets to carry waste back to dispose of in cesspits or for use in compost. Others simply left it where it landed, trusting the pigs and time to handle it. In spring, it could get overwhelming. By summer, the grass regrew green and suspiciously lush. In rare cases, towns tried to build new latrines outside the walls, hoping to contain the sprawl. But these often fell into disrepair. One city attempted to build a relief shed outside its eastern gate, complete with benches and a roof. Within months, it collapsed under its own weight and questionable engineering. The shed was never rebuilt. The field returned to service. Still, this morning ritual, strange as it may seem, served a purpose. It kept waste out of homes. It reduced the smell inside the city, and it gave people a bit of fresh air, a bit of space, and a small, undisturbed moment in an otherwise crowded, noisy life. So tonight, as you rest in a warm room with walls, a roof, and a toilet, just steps away, take a moment to picture the cloaked figure stepping past the city gate, squatting quietly beneath a crescent moon, and heading home with frost on their shoes and a story they'll never tell. Because sometimes privacy was found only in the open, and dawn was the one time no one asked where you were going, because everyone already knew. You're trudging up the winding staircase of a medieval tower, stone walls, slick with damp torchlight, flickering over uneven steps. You pass a tiny wooden door tucked into the thick masonry, barely noticeable unless you're looking for it, and you are. You open it, step inside, and find a small stone bench, a carved hole, and a shaft disappearing into the dark. This isn't a prison cell or a broom closet. This is a garderobe, the crown jewel of medieval toilet design. A garderobe wasn't just a fancy word for bathroom. It was a symbol of architectural ingenuity, social class, and misguided clothing storage practices. We'll get to that. And tonight, you're going to learn why this humble stone seat built into castle walls was both brilliant and deeply flawed. Let's start with what it was. A garderobe was a recessed space built into the outer wall of a stone building, usually a castle or manor, containing a bench with a hole. Waste dropped straight down through a vertical shaft, often leading to the base of the tower, a moat or a pit. It was the medieval version of indoor plumbing minus the plumbing. From the inside, it looked simple. From the outside, you'd see small, boxy projections jutting from the upper stories of towers' garderobe chute, often with a tiny spout or opening beneath. And if you were unlucky enough to be under one during use, well, let's just say you only made that mistake once. A well-placed garderobe was a status symbol. Not every room had one. Nobles often had garderobes attached to their private chambers, sometimes even with a little window for ventilation. Some castles featured double-seaters for couples who were exceptionally close or simply in a hurry. One French fortress boasted a 6-seater garderobe turret, which is either horrifying or incredibly efficient. But here's the fun twist. Garderobes weren't just for going. They were also used to store clothes. Yes, really. The idea was that the strong, persistent stench from the shaft would repel moths, lice, and other vermin. So nobles would hang cloaks, furs, and even armor near the opening, hoping the smell would preserve the garments. Historians still argue whether this worked or whether it just made everyone smell equally bad. The name itself comes from this dual function, garter to guard plus robe. So technically, it was the wardrobe's older, smellier cousin. Of course, these stone thrones weren't always pleasant. They were cold, especially in winter. There are stories of people placing warmed stones on the seat before use, or sitting on folded cloaks. One English noble wrote that the seat in February is the devil's own greeting. And they weren't exactly clean. Wind could blow back up the shaft. Rain could splash in. Birds sometimes nested in the chute, meaning you might be interrupted by flapping wings or a very startled pigeon. The occasional squirrel fell in. You learn not to ask questions. One quirky incident. At a castle in Wales, a knight attempted to escape an assassination by hiding in the garderobe shaft. He made it halfway down before getting stuck. The guards found him 12 hours later, alive, humiliated, and permanently banned from the guest list. Still, garderobes had their advantages. They removed waste from living spaces. They reduced chamber pot use, and in castles with multiple levels, the shaft design allowed for vertical stacking. Waste from the upper garderobes passed through lower levels, sometimes into designated pits, sometimes into moats, and sometimes into the unfortunate basement kitchens. One famous disaster: in 1183, a feast at a Scottish hall was ruined when the shaft backing up the Lord's garderobe overflowed into the wine storage room. Guests noticed a funk of earth and sulfur in the drink, and one poet later wrote, "Never hath wine so boldly betrayed its origin." Some castles went a step further and built garderobes over fast-moving streams, using nature to rinse the shaft clean. This was especially popular in mountainous regions where snowmelt could be diverted for flushing. Of course, this also meant the waste ended up downstream, not great if your neighbor's farm pulled water from the same source. By the late Middle Ages, garderobe construction became more elaborate. Architects added stone lips at the base to direct the flow away from walls. Some garderobes had doors. A few were painted. One even had a carved motto, "What is given shall pass." Still, they had limitations. Ventilation was poor. Maintenance was worse. Servants sometimes had to clean the shaft, a job so dreaded that it was often used as punishment. And during sieges, garderobes became security risks. Invaders would crawl up the waste chute, yes, into the castle if the shaft wasn't barred. One record from the siege of Carrickfergus tells of an infiltrator who made it 3/4 up the garderobe before fainting. Not from fatigues, from the smell. Yet for all their quirks, garderobes lasted centuries. They were standard castle features well into the Renaissance. Some even exist today, decommissioned, thankfully, but still visible as little stone boxes clinging to ancient towers. So tonight, as you enjoy the miracle of indoor plumbing, adjustable seats, and air freshener, think of the stone garderobe jutting out over the battlements, wind whistling through the shaft, a noble sitting in silence, a cloak hanging nearby. Because in a world of mud and mortar, even your most private moments deserved a little stone craftsmanship. You're wandering through the quiet corridors of a medieval infirmary. A healer passes by, cradling a wooden bowl of herbs. A patient groans softly in the corner, wrapped in wool, sweat glistening on his brow. The scent of rosemary hangs heavy in the air, less for healing, more to mask the other, less pleasant odors wafting up from the far end of the hall. Because in this place of healing, where wounds are cleaned and souls are soothed, there's one universal, unavoidable reality: everyone still has to go to the bathroom. And if you were sick in the Middle Ages, going wasn't just a necessity, it was a full-blown medical event. Let's begin with what doctors believed. In medieval medicine, influenced heavily by Galenic theory, waste wasn't just bodily output. It was evidence of your inner balance: poop, pee, sweat, vomit, all signs of which of your four humors was dominant or dangerously out of whack. You didn't just tell the doctor how you felt, you showed them your leavings. Healers would inspect stool texture, color, and smell with professional intensity. One 13th century physician described his process: "I do raise the vessel to my nose, and lo, if the odor be sour, the liver is ill at ease." Another noted that a greenish tinge foretells recovery, but tarry blackness foretells death or sin. Dramatic, yes. Scientific, not quite, but they believed it fully. Patients were often asked to collect their waste in ceramic bowls or chamber pots with smooth inner surfaces, ideal for visual inspection. These were then handed off to the healer or unfortunate apprentice for examination and diagnosis. And yes, this extended to urine too, examined in specially shaped flasks, known as machulas, held up to candlelight, like a medieval wine tasting gone terribly wrong. A quirky fact: some apothecaries even read feces the way astrologers read stars. Not joking. There were guides with illustrations describing 27 types of stool, each tied to a different treatment. If it floateth, said one manuscript, thou must purge the spleen with vinegar and horseradish. If it sank, better say your prayers. Now, if you were too weak to move, things got more complicated. Bedpans existed, although the term pan is generous. Often it was just a bowl or wide-bottomed jug. Nurses, usually monks, nuns, or hired caretakers, would slide these beneath patients and try to preserve both dignity and linen. Not easy, especially when straw mattresses absorbed more than just dreams. Cleaning was rudimentary. Waste was emptied into a pit behind the infirmary, or in better-run hospitals, into a drainage trench lined with herbs. Buckets were rinsed with vinegar or ash water, then reused. No gloves, no soap, just strong stomachs and stronger habits. In some institutions, particularly those run by religious orders, cleanliness was taken seriously, not for science but for sanctity. Bodies were vessels of God. Even their waste deserved proper handling. Monks recorded bowel movements in health logs. One abbey kept a book of excretions. Yes, it existed, tracking each patient's digestive progress alongside their spiritual confessions. But outside these havens, care varied wildly. In battlefield infirmaries or poor town clinics, patients relieved themselves in corners, buckets, or wherever they could. Floors were mopped with straw. Ventilation was non-existent, and infections spread like whispers in a confessional. Yet people tried. They really did. Some doctors created early enemas called clysters, administered with long curved nozzles made of wood metal or horn. These were filled with concoctions like warm milk honey or diluted wine, sometimes infused with herbs. Administered rectally, they were believed to rebalance humors and purge evil wind. Imagine being feverish, delirious, and suddenly greeted by Brother Gregory with a horn and a jug of chamomile, healing with a side of trauma. There was also the sweating cure. Sick patients were wrapped in layers of blankets, then placed near a fire until they perspired profusely. This sometimes helped, especially with fevers, but also led to accidents. One Italian infirmary recorded that 3 beds were lost to excessive night leakage during a particularly humid week in 1421. Healers understood this. Many wards kept extra sheets, herbal rinses, and wooden slats under mattresses to ease cleanup. One Benedictine scripter noted a clean bed is half the cure, the other half is humility. And perhaps no setting emphasized this more than plague hospitals. During outbreaks, patients were quarantined often by the dozen in makeshift shelters. Waste was everywhere. Caretakers worked in shifts, emptying pans, scrubbing floors, and burning soiled linens. Masks stuffed with rosemary didn't block infection, but they did block the smell. A small mercy. Still, some innovative hospitals tried better systems. One London facility experimented with tilted bed platforms, allowing waste to slide down into buckets beneath. Others placed privies inside patient wards, vented to the outside with clay pipes. These were rare but impressive. If the smell didn't kill you, the draft surely tried. So tonight, as you rest in comfort with modern medicine, just a phone call away, and sterile surfaces all around, imagine the healer kneeling beside a sweating patient, holding a clay bowl, whispering prayers over a sample. Because in the medieval world, healing wasn't glamorous, but sometimes it started with a look in the pot. You're high in the rafters of a medieval theater, watching a crowd gather below. The mood is festive. Street vendors shout, children chase each other, and the smell of roasted chestnuts drifts through the air. But as the performance begins, the reality of a large, tightly packed, ale-fueled audience sets in. Someone's going to need to pee. Welcome to the public performance potty problem. Because in medieval Europe, whether you were watching a mystery play in a churchyard, a juggler in the town square, or a traveling troupe perform the harrowing of hell, there was no intermission and no plumbing. Let's start with the theater crowd. Unlike today's neatly spaced auditoriums, medieval playgoers stood in open courtyards, pressed shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by mud noise and distraction. If nature called, your options were limited, very limited. Some cities, like London and Paris, began placing public latrines near performance spaces. But latrine in this case meant a wooden shack over a trench. Lines where long smells were epic, and some patrons decided not to bother. So what did they do? They used chamber pots tucked in alleyways, urinated against the back of buildings, or in more desperate cases, just let it go and walked away. A common saying at the time, if the jest be good, the breach is forgiven. Yes, people laughed off bathroom accidents if the show was funny enough. Historians still argue how accepted this was. One letter from a monk in York described a festival crowd as cheering the martyrdom of St. Alban while standing ankle-deep in puddle and piss. Another record from Florence warns pickpockets to avoid the south corner of the puppet square because the gutters overflow with ale-born shame. But it wasn't just audiences. Actors suffered too. Stage performers couldn't leave mid-act. Costumes were elaborate layers, thick and sets minimal. There are tales of jesters making emergency adjustments behind props or of actors feigning mid-soliloquy, either from dehydration or an unfortunate wardrobe accident. To combat this, some troupes built behind the stage privies, basic pits with cloth dividers. Others rehearsed pee break cues, moments in a play where background characters could sneak off stage without disrupting the flow. A quirky detail. In some performances, urination was part of the comedy. A fool might lift his tunic and mime relieving himself on a corrupt bishop's tomb, or use a real chamber pot emptied hopefully as a prop. The crowd roared. Crude humor was always in style. But what about religious plays? These performances, especially during feast days, could last 6 hours or more. Spectators sat on logs or stood on damp grass packed in tight. Clergy discouraged interruptions, so people brought personal urinals, especially the elderly. These were ceramic jars shaped to tuck beneath a cloak or long robe. You could discreetly shuffle to a corner, relieve yourself, and return before the next scene. And when night fell and the festival kept going, city cleaners called rakers walked through the grounds with carts collecting waste and straw. Some wore masks soaked in vinegar. One job listing in 1382 Edinburgh required a raker to have strong arms, no fear of foulness, and a tolerance for music played too loud. A Renaissance resume, basically. Of course, things got worse during drunken celebrations. taverns near theaters overflowed with patrons who pre-gamed the play. Many relieved themselves before they arrived, and some right outside the gates. There are records of doormen denying entry to drippers, meaning those clearly not in control of their bladder or their laces. Cities responded with pissing posts, wooden poles placed around public venues painted white and scented with herbs. You were supposed to use those. Most didn't, but it gave authorities a place to point to when they find you later. Still, despite the mess, people came in droves. They packed into town squares. They cheered morality plays. They laughed at farces. They sniffled through tragic ballads and tried not to step in anything. Because for most medieval folks, a play was more than entertainment. It was one of the few chances they had to laugh, cry, and escape, if only for a little while. So yes, they squatted behind carts. They brought jugs. They endured the smell and the squelch. And they did it all for the love of story. Because even when surrounded by stink, humans crave a good tale. So tonight, as you stream your favorite show, pause at mid-episode, and stroll to a silent, scentless bathroom, think of the peasant in wool stockings, holding his stomach, watching a fire-lit stage while praying the jester wraps it up before it's too late. Because art endures, and bladder control not always. You're seated in the corner of a quiet medieval scriptorium, where the only sound is the soft scratch of quills on parchment. Monks are hunched over illuminated manuscripts, painting saints with halos and dragons with too many teeth. It's serene, reverent. But one detail breaks the calm: a sudden creak, a rush of robes, and the unmistakable shuffle of someone needing to go, fast. Even in the most sacred centers of knowledge, bodily needs could not be denied. Tonight you'll discover how monks, scribes, and scholars manage their bathroom needs within the silent walls of monasteries, libraries, and scriptoria, places where thought was prized, time was sacred, and toilets were, well, creatively managed. Let's start with monastic schedules. Monks lived by a strict rule, especially those in Benedictine and Cistercian orders. Their days were broken into cycles of prayer work meals and silence, and tucked discreetly into this schedule was something not often written down, but very much accounted for: bathroom time. Yes, iske in between. Lauds and prime, there was the occasional trip to the reredorer, a communal latrine usually attached to the dormitory, often featuring multiple stone seats over running water. These weren't private stalls. They were long benches with arched cutouts, shoulder to shoulder, a quiet shared experience of monastic humility. And when monks worked in the scriptorium copying texts by hand, they weren't just allowed to leave whenever nature called. They had to signal. In some abbeys, monks used hand gestures, discreet signs like scratching the cheek or tugging a sleeve to ask for permission. Others placed a small pebble on the corner of their desk, an unspoken, "I'll be right back." There's a preserved rule from a 12th century English priory that states no monk shall speak nor make known his need save by agreed sign, lest the silence be broken. Imagine writing out psalms while your bladder fills and the pebble wobbles ominously beside your manuscript. But when permission was granted, the monk would make his way quietly to the reredorer, or in some cases, to portable chamber pots stored in nearby closets. These were emptied after work hours by novices, who quickly learned that obedience included mop duty. And then there's the great paradox: books and bathrooms don't mix, yet they always found a way to cross paths. Libraries often housed within monasteries or universities thus had no plumbing. If a scribe or scholar spent hours in study, they either had to leave their manuscripts unguarded or find creative solutions. In some institutions, library stools, small-lidded chamber pots, disguised as benches, were tucked under desks. Think of it as early office multitasking, questionable but practical, a quirky fringe detail. A 14th century scholar in Bologna kept a chamber pot under his writing desk and proudly named it Philosophia Secunda. He wrote in a letter, "Here I ponder, here I purge," and both are equally revealing. But these arrangements weren't without risk. In one legendary tale, a careless novice knocked over a full pot in the scriptorium of a French abbey, flooding a nearly completed Book of Hours. The resulting chaos led to a new rule: no vessel of relief shall be kept where parchment lies. Practical. Too late. Of course, silence wasn't always enforced. Some orders, like the Franciscans, were more forgiving. Laughter and conversation were allowed during chores, and a quick word before darting off to the latrine didn't warrant punishment. But in stricter orders, even the act of asking to relieve oneself was seen as a lapse in discipline. And then there's the question of nighttime needs. Dormitories were dark, drafty, and filled with 40 or more sleeping monks. Getting up to find the reredorer meant navigating cold stone corridors barefoot, guided only by the moon or a sputtering oil lamp. So many monks kept personal chamber pots beneath their beds, ceramic or metal cleaned each morning in silence. There's an account from a German monastery where a young monk mistook his neighbor's ink jar for a chamber pot in the dark. The result ruined scripture, a ruined friendship, and a week of extra fasting. Still, for all their focus on order, monks understood the body. Even the strictest rules made exceptions for illness. A constipated abbot was once granted permission to leave mid-mass, though not without a wry note in the annals. He departed urgently, and so did the Lord delay the homily. Historians still discuss how these rules evolved. Some argue they were acts of repression, controlling the body to elevate the soul. Others see them as practical, born of shared living, and the simple fact that monks poop too. So tonight, as you curl up with your favorite book, surrounded by quiet and comfort, think of the monk copying verses by candlelight, stomach rumbling pebble in place, waiting patiently for the moment to rise. Because in the halls of sacred knowledge, even wisdom had to wait its turn behind the privy door. You're lying in a loft bed, tucked under a thatched roof. Outside, the wind whispers through cracks in the wall. A cow shifts in the stall below. You've had a long day tending the fields, fixing the fence, helping your eldest patch the privy seat again. But now, as your eyelids droop and sleep begins to creep in, your bladder reminds you one last trip. And so you groan, swing your feet to the floor, and reach for your cloak and your chamber pot. Tonight we reach the end of our journey, the quiet moonlit reality of midnight relief in the medieval home. No pomp, no pipes, just you, the pot, and the dark. Because in the end, after all the castles and cloisters festivals, and trenches, bathhouses, and garderobes, most medieval people didn't poop in towers or moats. They didn't inspect their waste by candlelight or devise pulley-flushing thrones. They squatted over pots, shuffled to pits, or stepped out into the field behind the sheep pen and let the night air take it. It was a personal, quiet routine. Let's picture it one last time. You're in a small cottage, one room, maybe two. The hearth glows faintly. A dog sighs at your feet. You slide the lid off the chamber pot, trying not to wake the baby. You do your business quietly, and return the pot under the bed with a practiced hand. You'll empty it in the morning into the trench over the fence or behind the hedge. Maybe you'll toss a sprig of mint in for good measure. You're not gross. You're not lazy. You're surviving. Your ancestors built a world where waste was just part of life, like weather and work and war. They adapted, they engineered, they invented toilets in towers and sanitation under churches. They wore wiping cloaks and worshipped beside latrines. They scooped and scraped, sniffed and stirred, prayed and perched. And through all that, they laughed, they joked, they found humanity in humility. Because if there's one thing all of this shows, it's that nobody gets out of this quietly. Not nobles, not monks, not peasants, not kings. Whether you had a stone bench or a plank over a trench, you faced the same reality every day. You gotta go, even in the Middle Ages, especially in the Middle Ages. So tonight, as your breath slows and the hush of sleep draws near, feel the comfort of modern plumbing humming in the walls. Appreciate the distance, both time and smell, that separates you from the trench outside the gate. And remember that once upon a time, under candlelight or stars, someone very much like you stepped into the night, lifted their robes, and did what had to be done. Because this, dear listener, is the most boring, beautiful, bizarre part of history. We've always gone, we'll always go, and somehow we survive it. Wind down, 300 words, now. Let your eyes grow heavy. You've traveled far tonight, through echoing monasteries, crowded town squares, wind-blown battlements, and shadowy privy pits. You've seen peasants shuffle to the hedge at dawn, monks waiting silently in line, queens on velvet-cushioned seats, and weary soldiers squatting behind siege ladders. You've watched cities struggle under the weight of their own waste, and inventors dreaming of pipes and pulleys long before their time. But all of that is quiet now. The chamber pots are tucked beneath beds. The last torch has gone out in the hallway. The garderobes drip gently in the dark. Somewhere a donkey snorts in its sleep, and the world settles. Because the truth is, this history isn't grand. It isn't gilded. It isn't written in glowing letters across marble halls. It's humble, earthy, soft, and tonight it has rocked you to sleep. So breathe slowly. Feel the weight of the blankets around you, the hush of still air, the deep quiet of things left unsaid. Tomorrow will come with clean water and private stalls. But tonight, you're safe, you're warm, you're exactly where you need to be. Let the centuries fade behind your eyelids. Let the flicker of torchlight vanish. Let the last whisper of medieval wind die in the eaves, and rest. Because history's most enduring truth is this: even after the mess, even after the long, smelly journey, sleep finds us every time. 300 words. Now, let your eyes grow heavy. You've traveled far tonight through echoing monasteries, crowded town squares, wind-blown battlements, and shadowy privy pits. You've seen peasants shuffle to the hedge at dawn, monks waiting silently in line, queens on velvet-cushioned seats, and weary soldiers squatting behind siege ladders. You've watched cities struggle under the weight of their own waste, and inventors dreaming of pipes and pulleys long before their time. But all of that is quiet now. The chamber pots are tucked beneath beds. The last torch has gone out in the hallway. The garderobes drip gently in the dark. Somewhere a donkey snorts in its sleep, and the world settles. Because the truth is, this history isn't grand, it isn't gilded, it isn't written in glowing letters across marble halls. It's humble, earthy, soft, and tonight it has rocked you to sleep. So breathe slowly, feel the weight of the blankets around you, the hush of still air, the deep quiet of things left unsaid. Tomorrow will come with clean water and private stalls. But tonight you're safe. You're warm. You're exactly where you need to be. Let the centuries fade behind your eyelids. Let the flicker of torchlight vanish. Let the last whisper of medieval wind die in the eaves, and rest. Because history's most enduring truth is this: even after the mess, even after the long, smelly journey, sleep finds us every time. Word count 198 plus 300, wind down 1498.